I had planned this trip for months, mapping out every detail in my head, thinking about how peaceful it would be to escape the city for a while. The cabin was deep in the woods, far enough from the nearest town that there wouldn't be anyone passing by. The drive had taken hours, longer than I expected, twisting and turning on narrow, uneven roads that were sometimes little more than dirt tracks. By the time I finally pulled up to the clearing where the cabin sat, the sun was low, casting long shadows between the trees, making the forest look darker and more tangled than I had imagined in the daylight. The cabin itself was small but solid, made of old, weathered logs, with a tin roof that shone faintly in the last rays of sun. It had a porch with a rickety railing, and I noticed immediately that the steps leading up to it creaked under my weight. I parked my car off to the side on a patch of flattened grass, feeling a sense of isolation that made my chest tighten in a way I wasn't used to. The forest around the cabin was thick, and the trees were so close that I could barely see the sky above. The smell of wet earth and decaying leaves was strong. There was something about that smell that made me feel like the woods themselves were alive, watching, waiting. I unloaded my backpack, carrying supplies: food, water, a first aid kit, a flashlight with extra batteries, matches, and a small camping stove. I had brought blankets and a sleeping bag, though the cabin had a bed. I opened the cabin door, which stuck at first, groaning loudly as I pushed it. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the smell of old wood and dust. Sunlight from the high windows barely touched the far corners of the room, leaving long stretches of shadow that looked darker than they should have. There was a small kitchen area, a wood-burning stove, a table, and a single chair. The floorboards creaked underfoot, each step echoing through the quiet cabin in a way that made the hair on my neck rise. I spent the next hour setting things up, putting food in a small cupboard, laying the blankets on the bed, checking the windows and doors to make sure they were secure. Once that was done, I decided to take a walk around the clearing, partly to stretch my legs, partly to get a sense of the surrounding forest. The trees were dense, their branches twisting together, and the undergrowth was thick. It was easy to imagine losing the path if I wandered too far. Birds called in the distance, and I could hear the rustle of small animals in the leaves. As the light continued to fade, shadows stretched across the ground, turning familiar shapes into something strange and unfamiliar. Returning to the cabin, I decided to start a fire. I gathered some wood I found near the edge of the clearing, dry enough to burn cleanly, and arranged it in the stove. It took some effort to light, the flame flickering before finally catching and warming the cabin. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I watched the firelight dance across the walls, listening to the forest outside. That was when I first noticed the subtle sounds that I hadn't paid attention to before. A branch snapping in the distance, the occasional thump of something heavy moving through the underbrush, too loud for a small animal. My pulse quickened, and I realized that in the city, noises like this would go unnoticed. But here, alone, every sound was amplified, more menacing. Night fell fully, and with it came a silence that felt unnatural. The forest seemed to hold its breath. I tried to focus on practical things, reminding myself I had everything I needed: food, water, the cabin, my phone, though service was weak. Still, the isolation was pressing. Shadows from the fire stretched across the walls, and I caught myself imagining shapes that weren't there. Then, a sound. A knock, soft, deliberate, coming from the outside door. I froze. My mind raced through possibilities, none of them pleasant. I had locked the door, but the sound had come from the wood itself, or maybe something pressing against it. I waited, every muscle tense, listening. Nothing more happened. After a few minutes, I forced myself to relax, convincing myself it was probably a branch hitting the cabin in the wind. I slept fitfully that night, waking every hour at the slightest creak or rustle outside. Morning came, gray and overcast, with a cold drizzle making the forest smell damp and heavy. I went outside to inspect the cabin, walking the perimeter. The ground around it was soft and muddy, with footprints I hadn't noticed before. They were faint but definitely there, human footprints, not animal. They led from the edge of the clearing to the back of the cabin, then disappeared into the woods. My stomach sank. I had no neighbors, no one in the area, and the nearest road was miles away. Whoever had made these tracks was either still nearby or had been very recently. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone else had been camping nearby and walked past. But the thought of someone being in the forest, close enough to leave tracks, watching me, made my skin crawl. The next day, I tried to keep myself busy. I cleaned the cabin, organized supplies, and took another walk, sticking to the clearing and marked paths I had seen on the map. But each time I turned a corner, the forest seemed to close in. Sounds came from everywhere. Rustling in the leaves, branches snapping, heavy footsteps that didn't match my own pace. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone. By afternoon, I was exhausted from tension and lack of sleep. I returned to the cabin, double-checked every door and window, and sat in the corner closest to the stove, fire crackling beside me, trying to calm my thoughts. Then, I noticed signs that made my blood run cold. My firewood, which I had stacked neatly, was disturbed. Not all of it, just enough that someone had clearly touched it. Small smudges in the dirt outside suggested movement toward the back of the cabin. I felt trapped. I thought about leaving, but the rain had made the dirt roads nearly impassable for a standard car, and I had no cell service to call for help. Panic was rising, sharp and cold. I reminded myself to breathe, to think rationally. If someone was watching, the best thing I could do was make myself visible and unpredictable, maybe even intimidating. But all I could do was stay inside and hope they didn't try to enter. Night fell again, heavier than the first. I slept only in short bursts, waking to the slightest sound. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow moving outside the window, but when I blinked, it was gone. My mind was fraying. I spent hours checking doors, windows, making small barricades with chairs and pieces of wood. I rationed food and water carefully, knowing if I had to wait out someone watching, I couldn't afford to run out. The forest seemed to close in completely, every sound magnified, every shadow exaggerated. I began imagining the worst. Someone breaking in, someone following me into the woods if I tried to escape. My body tensed constantly, and my hands shook as I prepared for each sudden noise. By the third day, I realized I needed a plan. Staying in the cabin indefinitely was impossible, and waiting outside to try to hike out was dangerous with someone possibly nearby. I examined the cabin carefully, looking for any weak points, ways to defend myself. I found an old hunting knife in a drawer, rusty but usable, and a hatchet near the firewood. I arranged them within reach, telling myself it was about survival. Every little noise, the wind, the trees, small animals, triggered a spike of fear. I stopped trusting shadows entirely, expecting movement everywhere. Sleep became almost non-existent. I survived in brief, exhausted naps, and every time I woke, I checked the surroundings as if expecting an immediate attack. By the fourth day, I was running low on water and food. I had to leave no matter the risk. Early morning, I packed essentials into a small backpack. The knife, the hatchet, some granola bars, and a bottle of water. I planned to follow a stream I had noticed on the map, hoping it would lead to a road. Before leaving, I checked the cabin carefully one last time. The place was silent, but I had learned not to trust silence. I left a makeshift note inside, hoping someone might find it if needed, and stepped outside. The rain had stopped, leaving the forest damp and the dirt soft underfoot. I moved cautiously, trying to make as little noise as possible, constantly scanning for movement. Walking along the stream was slow and difficult. The undergrowth was thick, and fallen trees blocked the path repeatedly. But I kept going, using the knife to cut through branches and clear the way. Every crack of wood or rustle of leaves made my heart leap. Hours passed. Hunger and thirst gnawed at me, and fatigue made me stumble repeatedly. But I kept pushing, focusing on the sound of running water and the hope that it would lead to civilization. Finally, as the afternoon sun broke through the clouds, I heard a distant hum of a road and saw a clearing ahead. Relief hit me like a wave, exhausting and overwhelming. I broke into a run toward the clearing, finally leaving the forest behind. When I reached the road, I saw a car approaching. I waved frantically, and the driver slowed, letting me climb in. I was shaking, soaked, exhausted, but alive. I told them I had been stuck in the woods near an abandoned cabin, watched by someone I couldn't see. They listened, wide-eyed, and agreed to drive me to the nearest town. I called the authorities as soon as I could, reporting the cabin and the tracks I had seen, though by then, any trace of someone lurking nearby was gone. They never found anyone, and the cabin was eventually boarded up. Even after I returned home, months later, I could still feel the fear from those nights. The memory of being alone in the forest, hearing footsteps just outside the window, feeling trapped in a small cabin with no one around, stayed with me. I avoided forests for a long time, and when I did return, I never stayed in a place without company. That experience had left a mark, a reminder that isolation in the wrong place can be terrifying in ways that no imagination can match. The key to surviving had been staying calm, thinking logically, and moving carefully when leaving became necessary. By trusting my instincts and preparing for the worst, I managed to make it out alive. That cabin and the surrounding woods remain a place I will never return to, but the experience taught me the importance of caution, planning, and awareness of one's surroundings. I had survived, and that was enough to carry forward, though the memory of fear stayed sharp for a long time after. I had planned the trip for months. The cabin was deep in the woods, far from the main roads, and the images I had seen online made it look like a perfect escape. I wanted nothing more than complete solitude, away from the city, away from people, away from noise. I packed my car carefully, making sure I had enough food, water, and supplies for a week. I brought extra blankets, a first aid kit, flashlights, and a small stove. The last time I had been this far out in nature was years ago, and I remembered how quiet it could get. I was looking forward to it. I told myself it would be a peaceful retreat, a chance to think, to read, and to reconnect with myself. The drive there was long. The paved roads eventually turned to gravel and then to dirt. Trees crowded the sides of the path, their shadows long in the late afternoon sun. As I drove, I noticed how silent the world had become. There were no birds singing, no distant traffic, nothing except the crunch of my tires on the dirt. I parked my car near the small trail that led to the cabin. The sign marking the trail was faded and half broken. The last few hundred meters I had to walk, carrying my bag and supplies, and the forest around me grew denser with every step. The trees were thick, the underbrush tangled, and the path barely visible in some places. When I finally saw the cabin, relief and a strange sense of unease hit me at the same time. It was older than it looked in the photos. The wood was weathered and dark, almost black in some areas, with patches of moss climbing the walls. The windows were dirty, streaked with years of rain, and the door sagged slightly on its hinges. It looked empty. I had expected it to be rustic, but it had an abandoned feel. I hesitated, thinking about turning back, but I had already carried all my supplies this far, so I pushed the feeling aside and unlocked the door. Inside, it smelled damp and musty. The air was heavy, and the floorboards creaked under my weight. I set my bag down and took a slow look around. There was a small kitchen area, a table with 2 chairs and a fireplace. The bedroom was tiny, with a narrow bed, thin mattress, and a small dresser. The bathroom was old but functional, though the showerhead had rust inside. I unpacked, lighting candles and setting my things down. The first night passed slowly. I kept hearing noises. The wind through the trees, branches scraping the walls, small animals moving outside. My mind kept making shapes out of the shadows, but I told myself it was only nerves. I slept fitfully, waking up several times to check that the door was locked. The next day, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. I followed a narrow trail leading deeper into the woods. The trees were huge, their branches creating a thick canopy that let little sunlight through. I noticed signs of wildlife, broken branches, deep footprints in the mud, and bird calls that echoed eerily through the forest. As I walked, I felt increasingly aware that I was completely alone. No human presence, no sounds except the occasional animal. The solitude was peaceful at first, But as the hours passed, a creeping tension started to settle in. Every snap of a branch or rustle in the leaves made me jump. By the afternoon, I returned to the cabin and prepared dinner. I had brought canned food, but I also had a small knife and had collected some firewood from outside. As I cooked, I noticed that some of the wood I had gathered had scratches and marks that didn't make sense. At first, I thought it was natural, but then I realized that the marks were deep and uneven, almost like claws. I felt a knot form in my stomach, but I tried to ignore it. After all, the forest had wild animals. That was normal. That night, the noises grew louder. I kept hearing footsteps outside, slow and deliberate. My flashlight revealed nothing, but the sounds didn't stop. At one point, I thought I saw movement in the window reflection, a shadow that didn't belong to me. I froze, holding my breath, but after a few minutes, it disappeared. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, but sleep was impossible. I spent hours sitting on the bed, listening to the sounds of the forest pressing against the cabin. The next morning, I decided to check the perimeter. I walked around the cabin carefully. There were clear footprints in the soft earth near the back door, large, heavy, and human. I froze. No one was supposed to be here. I followed the tracks briefly, but they disappeared into the underbrush. Panic started to build, but I forced myself to stay calm. I told myself I was overreacting, that maybe someone had walked through the area earlier in the day. But the sense of being watched lingered. Over the next few days, the situation escalated. The sounds at night grew bolder. I could hear someone moving outside the cabin, pacing slowly, sometimes stopping and listening. I kept checking the locks, reinforcing the door with a chair, blocking the windows as best I could. I didn't sleep. My food started running low, and I realized that if someone was outside, I had no real way to defend myself. I thought about leaving, but the trail to the main road was long, and I didn't know if the person would be waiting for me along the path. One evening, I noticed that one of my windows was cracked. It hadn't been that way before. The wind could not have done it. Panic surged through me. I grabbed my flashlight and looked around. The cabin was empty inside, but the broken window confirmed my fears. Someone had been inside while I was out. I checked every room meticulously, but I found nothing missing. Still, the sense of danger was unbearable. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I stayed awake, sitting in the darkest corner of the cabin, listening, heart hammering. By the fourth day, I had run out of most of my food and water. I knew I had to leave. I packed as quickly and quietly as I could, taking only the essentials. Every shadow felt like movement. Every creak sounded like someone stepping closer. I waited until dusk, thinking the fading light might help hide me. I left through the back door, keeping low and moving carefully. The forest was denser than I remembered. Every step felt like it might reveal me to whoever was there. The footprints I had seen earlier were gone, but I felt eyes on me the entire time. I moved slowly, following what I hoped was the correct trail. The sun was dipping below the horizon, and the woods were darkening fast. I stumbled over roots, twisted my ankle, and fell several times, but I kept moving. I could hear the wind through the trees, the distant calls of animals, and sometimes a sound that was closer, like a branch breaking just behind me. I didn't dare turn around. The forest seemed endless, the darkness pressing in, and my fear grew with every step. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw a faint glow through the trees. I ran toward it, limbs burning, lungs aching. It was the road. A gravel path appeared, and I could see a car driving in the distance. I ran toward it, waving my arms, shouting. The driver slowed and stopped. I collapsed in relief, panting, shaking, and crying. They helped me into the car, and I explained in broken words that I had been alone in the woods and something was following me. The driver called the police. The authorities went back to the cabin with me the next day. They found evidence of someone breaking in, leaving tracks, and moving around the property. It wasn't much, just footprints and broken branches, but it was enough. They said it could have been a drifter or someone using the cabin as a hideout. I never went back. The police didn't catch anyone, and the cabin was eventually abandoned. Even now, thinking about it, I can feel the weight of those nights. The silence that wasn't silent, the feeling of being watched, and the endless darkness of the woods. I left my supplies, my plans, and my dreams of peace behind. That trip was supposed to be an escape, but it became one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. I survived, but the fear lingers. The forest keeps its secrets, and I will never return. I had been working night shifts for 6 months straight, and I felt like my mind was slowly breaking down. My sleep was messed up, I was living off coffee, and I could feel tension building in my body like wrapped chains. I decided to take a few days off and stay alone in a small cabin in the mountains where I would have silence, fresh air, and time to clear my head. I found a cheap cabin listing online that was isolated and not used much during winter. The listing only had a few photos and a short description, but I booked it without thinking much. I just wanted to be away from people and noise. The drive there took hours. The road got narrower and rougher the higher I went, and the cold thickened with every turn. I was alone on the road, and the sound of the car engine was the only constant noise. I felt weirdly calm. I had not been away like this for a long time, and I was hoping a break in fresh air would fix some of the stress crushing me. The cabin sat near the tree line with a long dirt driveway and no neighbors in sight. There was no sign of other cars or footprints. The surrounding woods were tall and uneven. The trees were dark and packed closely together, forming a thick wall at the edge of the open clearing where the cabin sat. The roof of the cabin was steep and covered in old metal sheets that rattled lightly in the wind. I parked the car and sat for a moment, staring at the place. I expected peace, but instead I felt something else, like a quiet pressure inside my stomach. Maybe it was just from not sleeping enough for weeks. Inside, the cabin smelled like old wood and dust. There was a small living room, a simple kitchen area, a single bedroom, and a bathroom that looked like it had not been cleaned well. The furniture looked used and old. The windows were small and looked out toward the woods. There were scratches on one of the wooden windowsills like something had rubbed or scraped against it multiple times. I noticed that immediately but forced myself to ignore it because I needed this break to work. I unpacked slowly, trying to relax. I made a cup of instant coffee and sat in a wooden chair near the small kitchen table. The wind hit the walls and roof, and the sounds felt strangely intense because there were no other noises around. No cars, no voices, no traffic, no electronics humming. Just wind across the metal roof, the ticking of the wall clock, and my own breathing. The first few hours were fine. I walked around outside near the cabin, breathing in cold air, trying to calm down. I looked at the trees. They were tall and thick, and the woods had almost no sound. No birds, no insects. It felt strange, but I told myself it was just the cold season keeping wildlife quiet. When I got tired, I went back inside, made simple food, and tried to rest. The first night was when things started to feel wrong. I was lying in bed, and the darkness outside felt heavier than normal. The cabin had no curtains, just open windows, and I could see only black through them because there were no outdoor lights. I left a small lamp on inside because the darkness felt too thick otherwise. I could hear the wind moving branches and the old roof creaking, and then, slowly, I heard what sounded like footsteps in the snow outside. They were slow and rhythmic, moving past the side of the cabin. I tried to convince myself I was imagining it because I had been exhausted for months, but I could hear them pressing snow down, one after another, not rushed, but steady. I lay still, staring at the wooden ceiling, and the footsteps stopped near the back wall of the cabin. I waited for more sound, but after a minute, I heard nothing. I stayed awake for hours listening to every noise. The cabin walls felt too thin and the darkness outside felt too close. I eventually fell asleep sometime early morning when exhaustion won over fear. When I woke up, daylight was weak and gray. I stepped outside, half expecting to see nothing, but the snow around the cabin had clear footprints. Not animal tracks, human footsteps, coming from the thick tree line, circling halfway around the cabin, then stopping at the back wall. They looked like one set of prints, not multiple. I stood staring at them, feeling something stiffen inside my chest. Logic told me maybe a hiker got lost or a hunter passed through. But why circle the cabin and stop right at the wall? Why in the middle of the night? Why not knock or shout for help? I followed the tracks toward the woods, but they disappeared only a few feet into the trees, as if the person stepped out of the snow and walked deeper where the ground was hard and patchy. The trees were dense. I couldn't see anything beyond the first few rows. I stayed outside only a minute more and then went back inside with a tight feeling running down my spine. The rest of the day was spent trying to shake it off. I cleaned the kitchen, wiped dust off shelves, made more coffee, and tried to read a book. The words blurred. I could still see the footprints in my head and the way they stopped at the back wall. I kept trying to dismiss it as nothing, but I found myself glancing out windows more than reading. The woods seemed darker even in daylight. Near evening, I heard the first strange sound from inside the cabin. I was sitting at the small table with the book open when something shifted in the attic space above. The cabin had a low slanted roof and a crawlspace attic with a simple wooden hatch. It sounded like weight shifting across wood, slow and dragging, then stopping. I froze and listened. The wind outside had died down, but the sound was clear, like something moving its body weight from one position to another on old floorboards. I waited for another sound. Nothing. I stood up and looked at the attic hatch. I stared at it for a while, feeling my chest tighten. My rational mind started fighting with itself. Rodents, maybe. Something old stored up there might have shifted. Old wood adjusting. Many logical reasons. But something about the weight of the sound felt heavier than a mouse or raccoon. I forced myself to ignore it. Night came again and the fear returned with it. This time I lay in bed fully awake, not even trying to sleep. I kept listening. The woods outside were silent again. That silence without birds or wind became almost painful. Hours passed and then I heard it again. Slow footsteps in the snow outside. They came from the trees, approached the cabin, reached the wall, and stopped. I stared at the ceiling, fighting the urge to move. I listened for breathing, for any tiny sound that would tell me what was out there. I could hear only the light ticking of the clock and the faint movement of something shifting in the attic again. I did not sleep at all. By morning, my body felt drained and shaky. I stepped outside as soon as there was enough light, and the tracks were there again. Same pattern. One set of footsteps from the trees, circling the cabin, stopping at the same area near the back wall. The prints were deeper this time, as if the person had stood there longer. On the third day, I started hearing sounds inside the walls. Small bumps, then longer sliding sounds, as if something was moving carefully behind wooden boards. Every noise felt amplified inside the small cabin. I tried turning on all the lights in the cabin to make myself feel safer, but it barely helped. What made it worse was knowing there was no cell service this high up. No internet, no neighbors, no town closer than an hour of driving through forest roads. If something happened to me, nobody would know. I tried to convince myself I was under too much stress and maybe I was imagining some of this. But the footprints were real. I had seen them 2 mornings in a row. And the noises above the ceiling were real. Even the wind could not explain footsteps in snow. I cleaned the kitchen again just to have something to do, moving my body around instead of standing still and listening. While cleaning under the counter, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. The wood under the cabinets had a small round hole drilled through it, not polished or finished, just a rough hole like someone made it quickly. Dust was disturbed around it, and there were tiny wood chips scattered, not old or discolored. They looked recent. I crouched and looked closer. The hole was angled forward and upward, in a position where if someone lay on the floor inside that space, they could look through it toward the living room area. I checked the other side under the sink where there was another hole, smaller, drilled into a board that pointed toward the bedroom. I stood there staring at it, and the silence around me felt different now, like I had never been alone in that cabin at any point. I walked through the room slowly, trying not to panic. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my teeth. I felt the walls with my hand, imagining someone on the other side of them. I slowly approached the attic hatch, staring up at it. I had not checked the attic since arriving. I had no interest in seeing what was up there, but now I started thinking about the noises, the shifting weight, the drilled holes. I started imagining someone climbing around the attic space, slowly moving above me at night. My hands were shaking slightly. I stood there for several minutes before stepping back. I waited for day to pass slowly. The sky got cloudier and the woods looked almost black by afternoon. I felt tension building inside me so thick I had trouble focusing on anything around me, even though the cabin interior was small and simple. I decided I needed air. I went outside and walked around the cabin, following the perimeter where the footprints had been. The snow was undisturbed on this third day. No new tracks, but that almost felt worse. I walked toward the trees, staring into the dark, hollow spaces between trunks. My eyes played tricks on me, turning shadows into shapes. I walked maybe 10 steps into the forest edge and then stopped. The silence was too heavy. I felt like I was being watched from multiple directions. I turned back toward the cabin and noticed something I had missed on earlier days. One of the small attic vents near the roofline had dark smudges on the wood around it, like someone had gripped the frame with dirty hands while hanging or climbing. The prints were faint but visible. I stared up at them, and the fear inside my chest finally shifted into something close to horror. It felt like proof that someone had been climbing near or into the attic. I had planned this trip for months, imagining the solitude, the quiet, the break from everything that was constantly pressing against me in the city. The cabin was tucked deep in the mountains, miles from any road, unreachable except by a rough trail that twisted up from the nearest town. I arrived late afternoon, the sun slanting orange through the tall pines, the air crisp and sharp with the smell of wet soil and pine needles. The last stretch of the trail had been a struggle. My truck could not go further, so I had hiked the remaining mile with my pack, boots sinking into soft mud and snow in patches. The cabin was small, a single story with rough timber walls and a steep, dark roof. Its windows were dirty, clouded by dust and age, but the door was solid, heavy, and gave the impression of real security. I set my pack down and stretched my aching shoulders, listening to the wind in the trees, the occasional creak of branches, and the distant sound of a creek flowing somewhere behind the ridge. The quiet was intoxicating and unsettling at the same time. It had been years since I had been somewhere so isolated, and even though I had prepared for it, I felt a little pulse of unease in my chest. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and dampness. Dust covered every horizontal surface, and cobwebs hung in corners, but it was solid. I had brought my own firewood, but there was already a stack by the stone fireplace, dry and ready. I lit the fire slowly, enjoying the warmth, watching the flames catch and spread. My pack contained enough food for a week, a first aid kit, extra clothing, and my small stove, though with the fireplace I didn't need it. I unpacked methodically, placing my things on the floor and the table, noting the layout of the small cabin. A single bedroom in the back, a tiny bathroom with a functional toilet and sink, a main living space, and the fireplace dominating one wall. I spent the first night mostly settling in, making a small meal of canned beans and bread, washing up in the basin, and arranging my bedroll. The fire kept the cabin warm, and I felt the deep relief of being alone with nothing pressing in from outside. I fell asleep with the quiet as my companion, the wind occasionally rattling the windows. It was the second night that things started to feel off. I woke before dawn, the wind having died down, replaced by an eerie silence. I thought I heard a soft snapping of a twig outside, but I convinced myself it was the old cabin settling. Still, the feeling stayed, a prickling at the back of my neck, a sense that I was not as alone as I thought. I got up, walked to the window, and peered into the darkness. The forest pressed against the cabin like a wall. Nothing moved. I went back to bed, heart racing, telling myself it was just nerves. The next day, I tried to shake it off. I spent hours chopping firewood, clearing a small path around the cabin, and walking a short distance down the trail to stretch my legs. Everything was normal, but the feeling lingered, like a shadow just outside my vision. That evening, as the sun sank behind the peaks, I noticed something strange. A set of footprints in the soft mud near the creek, larger than mine, and leading toward the cabin. My stomach tightened. They were fresh, not more than a few hours old. I walked around, looking for more signs, but the forest was dense, hiding whatever might have left them. I returned to the cabin, securing the door and windows more carefully, pulling the curtains shut. That night, the snapping of twigs was louder, closer. I sat by the fire, listening, gripping a heavy iron poker. Every so often, I thought I heard breathing outside, or the soft scuff of a boot on stone. I stayed awake longer than usual, heart hammering, every shadow seeming to grow and twist in the firelight. I tried not to imagine someone moving in the trees, stalking me, waiting for a mistake, but the thought was inescapable. By the time I finally fell asleep, it was light outside, and I was exhausted. Over the next days, the feeling intensified. The footprints returned repeatedly, sometimes circling the cabin, sometimes heading off into the woods, always fresh. Once, I saw a shadow moving in the tree line at dusk, quick and deliberate. I told myself it could be a hunter or another hiker, but the isolation of this area made that unlikely. My supplies began to feel inadequate. The woods were dense, the trail dangerous, and the idea of going for help seemed impossible. Every evening, I reinforced the cabin, stacking firewood around the door, checking locks, and preparing to defend myself if necessary. I realized that I had underestimated just how alone I was, how vulnerable. The first confrontation happened late on the fourth night. I woke to a noise, a deliberate, careful scraping at the door. My breath caught, muscles tensed. I grabbed my small hatchet and tiptoed toward the door. The sound stopped as soon as I reached it. I held my breath, straining to hear over the pounding of my own heart. Minutes passed. Nothing. I backed away slowly, knowing that if someone had been out there, they had probably heard me moving. I stayed awake the rest of the night, fire burning low, eyes on the windows. By the next day, I realized the stakes had changed. Whoever was out there knew the cabin, knew I was alone, and was patient. I had no way to call for help, no way to know exactly what they wanted. I began preparing for the worst. I cleared the trail of loose branches that could give me away, reinforced the door with a fallen log from the firewood pile, and made sure everything that could serve as a weapon was within reach. I rationed food and water more carefully, knowing that I might be stuck here for several days if things escalated. The following nights were a continuous cycle of fear and vigilance. Every noise in the forest set my heart racing. I stayed close to the fire, listening, watching, waiting. The intruder, if it was an intruder, never revealed themselves fully, never made a direct attack. It was psychological, a slow terror, being observed without confrontation. The footprints, the occasional shadow, the quiet scuffing of boots, all were reminders that I was not safe, even in my own fortified space. Then, on the seventh night, something changed. The wind shifted, carrying a faint smell that did not belong in the forest. Smoke, maybe, or some chemical I could not place. My ears caught a soft scraping outside, repeated, deliberate. I grabbed my hatchet and flashlight, approaching the door cautiously. When I shone the beam outside, I saw movement in the darkness, something retreating into the tree line. I stepped outside, breathing hard, scanning the woods. There was nothing, only the quiet murmurs of the forest at night. But the footprints were different now, hurried, deeper, as if the person had moved faster than before. By the next morning, I had made a plan. I could not stay passive. I packed a small bag with essentials: water, food, my first aid kit, fire starter, and my hatchet. I left the cabin as usual, taking extra precautions, moving quietly through the forest to follow the trail downhill to the road. I had memorized the way, and the morning light made the woods less menacing, though still unnervingly empty. I moved slowly, checking behind me constantly. Several times I thought I heard someone following, a branch breaking, a snapping twig, but each time I paused and waited. Nothing. When I finally reached the road, relief washed over me, but I did not stop moving until I reached a small ranger station half a mile away. There were people there, radios, vehicles, a way to communicate. I told them everything: the isolation, the footprints, the nightly sounds. They listened, serious, and offered to drive me back to town and send a ranger team to check the cabin. I agreed without hesitation. The moment I was in the vehicle, with the engine running, surrounded by other humans, I finally allowed my body to relax. The fear, the tension, the constant watchfulness. It lifted slowly, like fog clearing from the mountains. The cabin, when I finally returned weeks later with the Rangers, was quiet, undisturbed but clearly watched. The footprints had ceased. Whoever had been following me had stopped, abandoned the pursuit. I never found out who or why, only the traces they had left behind. The experience left a mark on me, a reminder of vulnerability and the unpredictability of isolation. But it also gave me a profound appreciation for the basics of preparation, caution, and human instinct. I learned that solitude in the wilderness could be both restorative and dangerous, and that the human mind could create constant vigilance when survival seemed at stake. I went back to the city changed. I avoided unnecessary risk, carried awareness with me everywhere, and respected the quiet. But I never stopped thinking about that cabin in the mountains, the nights of tension and fear, the silent stalker I never saw but always felt. In a strange way, I was grateful. It taught me resilience, attention to detail, and the deep, primal understanding of being truly alone and alert. The woods had not broken me, and I had come through, cautious, wary, but alive. And that was a clarity I carried long after, a tangible lesson learned in the darkness, in the silence under the watching trees. I had planned the trip for months, and I had convinced myself that it was going to be peaceful, a chance to escape the constant noise of life in the city. The cabin I rented was far from the main road, deep in the mountains where cell service was weak and the nearest town was at least an hour away. The description online made it sound perfect. A small, wooden structure surrounded by trees, with a creek running nearby and a little porch that overlooked a valley. I had imagined mornings where sunlight would filter through the pine trees, afternoons spent reading or exploring the nearby trails, and nights falling asleep to the sound of water and wind through the branches. The drive to the cabin was long and winding. The closer I got to my destination, the narrower the roads became. At some points, it felt like they hadn't been maintained in years. Gravel crunched under my tires, and branches scraped the sides of the car. The air smelled different here, fresher, damp with pine and moss. I could feel the tension in my shoulders slowly easing, replaced by a quiet anticipation that made my stomach feel tight with excitement. When I finally reached the cabin, it looked exactly like it had in the photos, maybe even smaller than I imagined, but that added to the charm. The wood was dark and rough, weathered from years of sun and rain. The porch was worn, boards uneven, and the railing loose in one section. I parked my car on a patch of flattened grass and took a moment to just look around. The trees were dense, so dense that the cabin almost disappeared into the forest from certain angles. The creek trickled softly nearby, the sound soothing, almost hypnotic. I grabbed my bag and made my way to the door. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and damp. Dust covered the corners, and cobwebs clung to the ceiling beams. The furniture was old but sturdy, a wooden table in the center, a few chairs, a small stove in the corner. A single bed with a thin mattress was pushed against one wall. There was no electricity, but a stack of candles sat on the table, along with a few matches. The cabin had a small bathroom, a tin sink, and a shower, though the water came from a tank outside and was lukewarm at best. I unpacked slowly, putting my things away, making the place feel a little more like mine for the next few days. The first night, I went to bed early. I had hiked some of the trails near the cabin in the late afternoon, and even though they were short, my legs ached and my back felt sore from carrying my bag. I left the window slightly open to hear the creek and the wind through the trees. At first, the sounds were comforting, almost like nature itself was keeping me company. But as the hours passed, I began to notice other sounds. Branches snapped in the distance, a rustling among the leaves. Sometimes I would hear a low, irregular thump that made me tense, waiting for the next sound. My mind tried to reason with me. Deer, small animals, the wind, but my heartbeat was quick, and I couldn't sleep. The next morning, I decided to explore further. The trail I followed led uphill through thick undergrowth over rocks and fallen logs. My boots sank into mud in places, and my hands often brushed against branches or rough bark. The trail became steeper and more difficult to follow, but the view from the top of the ridge was worth it. The forest stretched endlessly, a sea of green broken by patches of sunlight. I stayed there for a while, breathing hard, listening to the forest, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. But as I looked around, I noticed something odd. The path I had taken was disappearing behind a tangle of branches, as if the forest was closing in. I retraced my steps carefully, marking the trees to find my way back, until finally I reached the cabin again, sweaty and tired, but reassured by the familiar sight. That night, the unease returned. The wind had picked up, rattling the cabin's wooden frame. I had prepared a small fire in the stove to keep warm, and the shadows from the flames danced across the walls. I kept thinking I heard footsteps outside, but when I looked, there was nothing but darkness and trees. My mind began to imagine shapes moving between the trunks, long limbs or dark figures slipping through the brush. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was just the wind or animals, but the sounds persisted. Sometimes it would be a snap, a rustle, or a low grinding sound that didn't belong to anything I recognized. My pulse quickened each time I heard it. The following day, I decided to hike to the creek I had seen from the porch. It was not far, but the path was rough, and I had to climb over fallen logs and through thick undergrowth. When I arrived, the creek was shallow, clear, and cold. I took off my boots and dipped my feet in, the water making me shiver. The peace lasted for a while, but then I noticed something that made me uneasy. On the opposite bank, footprints in the mud led upstream, large and uneven. They weren't mine, and they didn't match any animal tracks I recognized. The prints disappeared after a few yards, as if whoever or whatever had made them had jumped into the forest. I felt a shiver of fear but tried to dismiss it. Someone might have come through recently, hikers or campers, nothing more. Still, I kept glancing around nervously, trying to spot any movement, any sign of life, but the forest seemed empty. That evening, as the sun fell, the isolation began to feel heavier. The forest around the cabin was alive with noises I had never paid attention to before. Twigs snapped close to the cabin, leaves rustled, and I could hear the faint scuttling of animals. I kept my small knife within reach, feeling silly but also reassured. I checked the windows and doors several times, making sure everything was secure. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and the shadows of the trees outside seemed larger, more imposing. Each creak of the cabin floor made me jump. The wind howled through the gaps in the wood, carrying a strange, hollow sound that I couldn't identify. I realized then that this was not like being in a city, where every sound has a source, you know. Here, every sound was unknown and unpredictable, and my imagination began to run wild. Sleep was impossible that night. I stayed awake, listening to the cabin settling, the wind, and the occasional distant thump. I could not tell if the sound was someone walking outside or a branch falling. I kept imagining shapes just beyond the windows, dark silhouettes moving silently. At some point, I got up and checked the doors and windows again, and everything seemed secure. Still, I could not shake the feeling of being watched. The hours passed slowly, and when morning finally arrived, I was exhausted, barely able to keep my eyes open, yet relieved to see daylight filtering through the trees. The next day, I decided to make a fire outside on the porch. I thought that having the fire burning and smoke rising might deter animals or anyone who might be nearby. As I gathered wood and built the fire, I noticed something strange. A small pile of branches and leaves had been moved near the edge of the forest, close to the cabin. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but I could tell that someone or something had been there recently. My stomach tightened. I tried to reason it away, telling myself it could be a deer or a raccoon, but the way the pile had been arranged felt deliberate. That night, I could not sleep at all. Every snap, every rustle made me flinch, my eyes darting to every shadow. I stayed near the stove, knife in hand, staring out the window until the sky lightened with dawn. Over the next day and a half, I began noticing more signs. footprints near the cabin, disturbed underbrush along the trails I had taken, and a general sense that I was not alone. I became hyper-aware of every sound, every movement. Even the creek, which had seemed so peaceful before, now felt ominous as I heard water shifting rocks in ways that didn't make sense. My mind constantly tried to rationalize, but there was no ignoring the feeling of being followed, watched, and tested by some presence in the forest. By the third night, I had made a decision. I would leave at first light and drive back to town, even if it meant abandoning the rest of my trip. I could no longer ignore the feeling of danger. The isolation that had once seemed peaceful now felt threatening. I spent the night sitting on the floor near the door, knife in hand, listening to every sound, my ears straining for anything unusual. Branches snapped close to the cabin, and I swore I saw shadows moving between the trees. I stayed awake until the faint glow of morning appeared through the window. When the light came, I packed quickly. I checked the cabin one last time, making sure I had nothing behind, but I noticed more signs of disturbance. The small pile of branches had been moved, and there were fresh footprints leading toward the cabin from deeper in the forest. I didn't wait to investigate. I loaded my bag into the car and started the engine, my hands trembling from exhaustion and fear. The drive back to town was tense. Every sound, every shape outside the car felt like it could be someone following me. When I finally reached the highway, the tension eased slightly, but I stayed alert until I was surrounded by the signs of civilization. Other cars, houses, people. The isolation that had been inviting now seemed like a trap I had narrowly escaped. Once home, I unpacked, showered, and tried to process everything. I realized that the forest, the cabin, and the isolation had shown me how quickly a peaceful place could turn threatening when you are alone and unprepared. The experience stayed with me for weeks, the memory of footsteps in the dark, shadows that might have been animals or something else, and the overwhelming fear of being completely alone in a place that seemed familiar yet unknowable. I never went back to that cabin, and I made sure that future trips were closer to people, closer to help, and far from the kind of isolation that can twist even the most serene environment into something dangerous. I had been planning this trip for months, ever since I found that old cabin listed on a small local website for rentals. It was deep in the mountains, off the main roads, and surrounded by thick forests. The pictures were basic: a small wooden cabin with a porch, a stone chimney, and a few windows that reflected the pine trees around it. The description promised complete isolation and quiet. I had wanted that. I wanted to escape, to be alone, to feel the stillness that only comes when the world feels like it has disappeared. I didn't want any distractions. No noise, no people, no technology except my old camera and my backpack with supplies. I arrived in the late afternoon. The road leading to the cabin was little more than a dirt track, winding steeply up the mountains. The forest was dense, and the sun was low, casting long shadows between the tall pines. I remember the way the air smelled sharp, cold, and fresh, with a faint tang of moss and wet leaves. As I drove, I noticed the silence. Not the kind of silence where there is just no sound, but the kind where everything seems muted. The tires on the dirt path sounded hollow, echoing in a way that felt strange and almost unnatural. There was no wind, no birds calling, not even the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. I reached the cabin as the last light faded. It looked exactly like the pictures. Small, unpainted logs, a wooden porch with a couple of broken chairs, and the smell of damp wood that had been there for years. I parked my car to the side, grabbed my backpack, and unlocked the door. The cabin smelled of dust and old wood, with a faint metallic tang from the fireplace. The inside was small. One main room, a tiny kitchen in the corner, a loft above for sleeping, and a bathroom that smelled of mold. There was a stack of firewood next to the stone fireplace, and a few small rugs on the floor. The windows were grimy but looked out over the dense forest. I unpacked slowly, taking in the quiet. There was no sound of humans, no cars, no voices. I could hear my own movements. Every step I took sounded like it echoed inside the cabin. I found a box of matches and some kindling and decided to light a fire. As I struck the match, the room seemed even darker around the edges, like the fire illuminated only a small circle, leaving the rest in shadow. I stacked the wood carefully, struck another match, and finally got the fire going. The flames crackled, sending light bouncing across the walls. I sat on the floor, watching it, feeling a sense of satisfaction. It smelled of wood smoke, dry and sharp, filling the cabin with warmth. That night, I slept in the loft, a small space with a thin mattress. Outside, the forest was completely dark. I couldn't see anything beyond the nearest trees. Occasionally, I heard noises, branches snapping, a dull thump, or the distant scraping of something against a tree. I told myself it was the wind or deer or some small animal moving through the underbrush. The isolation felt intense, almost oppressive. I had wanted quiet, and now it was complete. The next morning, I woke early. Mist hung low over the forest, and the air smelled wet and earthy. I made coffee on a small camping stove and sat on the porch, staring at the forest. I felt exposed, like the trees were watching. I decided to explore the nearby area. I had a small map, but it was vague, showing only some trails that weren't maintained. I grabbed my backpack, put on boots, and walked along a narrow path leading into the trees. The forest was thick. The trail was littered with fallen branches, moss-covered rocks, and roots that jutted out like traps. I walked carefully, making sure each step was stable. As I went deeper, I noticed something. The forest, while dense, had patterns of movement that didn't make sense. Branches seemed broken in the same way in several places, almost as if someone had passed through. The underbrush was trampled in irregular patches. I paused, listening. The forest was alive with sound now. Tiny rustles, faint cracks of branches, but they were uneven, unnatural. I kept walking, telling myself it was probably animals, maybe deer or bears moving in the shadows. But a part of me felt tense, like I was being watched, and not by anything normal. Around midday, I returned to the cabin, sweaty and tired. I decided to rest. The fire was still warm, the wood crackling quietly. I unpacked my camera and went through some of the photos I had taken on the way up, checking the details of the forest, the path, the trees. One photo caught my attention, a blurry figure among the trees. At first, I thought it was a mistake, a trick of the light, but the shape was definitely human, tall, thin, partially hidden behind a tree. My heart skipped. I knew there was no one else supposed to be here. The area was remote. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone had passed through the trail and I hadn't noticed. Maybe a hunter. Maybe it was nothing. I told myself not to worry. I locked the cabin door, checked the windows, and tried to focus on chores. Stacking firewood, cleaning the cabin a little, preparing food. But the feeling didn't leave. Every noise outside, the creak of a branch, the rustle of leaves, made me tense. I began noticing small details. A foot-shaped indentation in the soft earth near the porch, the faint smell of smoke other than mine, and what sounded like slow, deliberate footsteps on the forest floor outside, just beyond the line of sight. As night came, the forest seemed louder. I stayed near the fire, moving logs around, trying to keep myself busy. The shadows beyond the firelight were deep, moving slightly. Occasionally, I thought I saw shapes among the trees, watching, waiting. The sound of something scraping or dragging along the ground echoed in the darkness. I stayed very quiet, listening. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. Around midnight, I noticed a light flicker in the distance. Not the fire, not a flashlight. Something small, moving slowly between the trees. My first instinct was to hide, to avoid being seen. I moved closer to the cabin's interior, keeping low, and watched. The light disappeared. I told myself it was probably a reflection, a trick of my eyes, but my stomach tightened. The sense of danger became palpable. Couldn't shake it. Hours passed. The night dragged on, with small noises punctuating the silence. The scrape of something against a tree, a low thud in the distance, footsteps that seemed to circle the cabin slowly. I didn't sleep. I stayed near the fireplace, holding a heavy branch in one hand, staring into the darkness outside. The forest felt like it had grown closer, pressing in. Every shadow could hide a person, every rustle a potential threat. I realized I was completely unprepared for human contact here. There were no neighbors, no nearby roads, no phones with signal. If someone wanted to harm me, there would be no one to help. By morning, exhaustion was heavy, but I knew I had to act. I packed my backpack quietly, leaving the fire burning low, and planned my exit. I intended to take the path back to the main road, moving cautiously. I stepped outside. The morning mist had settled thicker, almost as if the forest was holding its breath. My eyes scanned every movement, every shadow. A branch snapped behind me, and I froze. The indentation of footprints I had noticed yesterday was closer, fresher. Someone had been near the cabin overnight. I didn't stop to think. I moved fast, careful to avoid noisy branches or loose rocks. Every step I took was deliberate. I could hear occasional movement behind me, slow, patient, following. I didn't look back. My mind raced with survival strategies, with trying to figure out who it could be and what they wanted. I focused on the main trail. It was barely visible under the thick pine needles, but it led downhill, eventually to the dirt road I had driven on. Hours passed as I carefully moved through the forest. My legs burned, my body ached, but the tension didn't fade. At one point, I thought I heard voices whispering from the trees, but I realized it was probably the wind or distant wildlife. Still, I kept moving. The further I went, the more I recognized landmarks. A large rock shaped like a broken slab, a twisted old tree, a small creek. Finally, the trees thinned, and I could see the road. Relief surged, but I remained cautious, scanning for anyone who might be lying in wait. I reached my car, exhausted and tense, and immediately locked the doors once inside. I started the engine, my hands shaking. As I drove down the winding road, I kept glancing into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following. There was nothing, only the empty forest stretching behind me. When I finally reached a small town several miles down the mountain, I stopped at a gas station, shakily filling the tank. The bright fluorescent lights and the distant hum of cars felt like safety itself. I never returned to that cabin. Later, I learned from a local ranger that the area had occasional trespassers, some of whom were dangerous, using the remote cabins as hideouts. I realized I had been lucky, that the presence I felt all those nights had probably been someone watching, waiting. The sense of isolation, the darkness, the noises of the forest, all of it had been magnified by the fact that I was completely alone, unprepared. The memory of the cabin stayed with me for years. I could recall the smell of the damp wood, the way the firelight cast long shadows, the way the forest pressed close and silent. I still occasionally think about what might have happened if I hadn't noticed the footprints, if I had stayed another night, if I had gone to sleep. I was lucky. I survived. But that small, abandoned cabin in the middle of nowhere taught me something I had never known. Isolation can be terrifying in ways no horror story can capture, and danger doesn't need ghosts to be real. I had planned this cabin trip for months, the kind of trip where everything is stripped down, simple, and isolated. Just me, a small wooden cabin in the woods, and the surrounding wilderness. I thought I was prepared. I had a solid sleeping bag, plenty of food, a first aid kit, extra water, and all the gear I could carry. The drive there had been long, along a twisting mountain road, lined with dense forest on either side, the kind where sunlight barely touched the asphalt. I felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Being alone in the forest had always fascinated me, but now that I was here, I could feel the weight of the isolation pressing in. The cabin itself was nothing fancy. A small, one-room structure made of rough-hewn logs, with a stone fireplace, a tiny kitchen corner, and a loft for sleeping. I remember stepping inside and noticing the smell of dust mixed with pine, the faint, musty odor of disuse. It was empty, silent, and still, but it felt safe somehow, like it had been waiting for someone to come. I spent the first hour unpacking, arranging my supplies, and checking every corner, just to make sure nothing was broken or unsafe. The windows were thick and sturdy, the door locked firmly, and the roof seemed solid. I told myself I had no reason to worry, but still, every now and then, I would pause and listen. The forest around the cabin was alive with sound. The rustle of leaves, the distant cry of birds, the faint hum of insects. But it was a quiet hum, not the kind that disturbed, just the kind that reminded me I was completely alone. The first night was calm. I built a small fire in the fireplace, ate a simple dinner, and watched the flames flicker. The light of the fire cast long, moving shadows on the walls. The wind outside caused the cabin to creak and groan, and at first it made me jump every time, but eventually I grew used to it. I went to bed feeling tired but safe, cocooned in my sleeping bag in the loft, with the faint smell of smoke lingering in the air. I slept well that night, and when I woke in the morning, the sunlight filtering through the windows made the cabin look warm and inviting. The first day, I decided to explore the surrounding woods. There was a small trail leading from the cabin into the forest, barely wide enough for one person, overgrown in places but still passable. I walked for hours, taking in the details of the forest, the rough bark of trees, the small plants growing along the path, the occasional animal tracks in the dirt. It was peaceful, almost hypnotic. But as I wandered deeper, I began to notice how easy it would be to lose my bearings. The trees all looked the same, the trail twisted unexpectedly, and landmarks that seemed obvious at first quickly became confusing. I kept a mental note of the path, marking trees when I passed them, but still, a small part of me worried about getting lost. Returning to the cabin, I felt a sense of relief. The structure felt like a haven, a place where I could shed the unease that came with wandering so far into the wilderness. I spent the evening gathering firewood, organizing my supplies, and preparing food. The nights were long, darker than I remembered from city life. The absence of any artificial light made the darkness feel almost solid. I realized that even the sound of my own movements, my footsteps on the wooden floor, the scrape of my knife against a cutting board, sounded amplified. The solitude became heavier with each hour. On the second day, I noticed something strange. First, I thought it was my imagination. A faint noise outside the cabin, almost like footsteps, crunching on dead leaves. I froze and listened. Nothing, just the usual rustle of the wind. I told myself it had been the forest, that it was normal. But then it happened again, later in the day, when I was collecting water from a small stream nearby. The sound was deliberate, too steady to be a deer or a bird. It stopped when I paused and started again when I moved. I tried to see through the thick underbrush, but there was nothing. No human, no animal, nothing but shadows and branches. My stomach sank, and a tight knot formed in my chest. I went back to the cabin, locking the door and bolting the windows. I checked my supplies again, even though I had done it the night before. The thought of someone being nearby, watching, or following me was terrifying. I tried to rationalize it, perhaps hikers, maybe hunters, but the area was remote. Very few people came here. I told myself it was just nerves, the isolation playing tricks on me. But deep down, I could not shake the feeling that I was not alone. That night, I barely slept. Every sound, the wind rattling the windows, a branch tapping against the roof, made me sit upright in bed. My flashlight became my lifeline, and I kept it close. Hours passed. The darkness outside became almost oppressive. I tried to focus on normal thoughts, but I could not stop imagining someone lurking in the trees, waiting. When dawn finally broke, I felt a mixture of relief and dread. I knew the day would not be easy. The third day brought a subtle escalation. I woke to find small disturbances near the cabin. Footprints in the soft soil, a branch broken just outside the door. Someone had been here close enough to touch the cabin. I checked my supplies, counted my food, and found everything intact but my nerves frayed. The forest seemed to close in, denser and more threatening. I avoided going too far from the cabin, instead choosing to observe from the safety of the porch. I began setting small traps, rudimentary ones, for my own protection, nothing dangerous, just alarms if someone tried to approach. By the fourth day, the fear became tangible. Every sound had a source in my mind. Snapping twigs, shifting leaves, even the call of a distant bird. I realized that being trapped in the cabin could be dangerous if someone truly meant harm. I began to plan an exit strategy, noting the terrain, identifying the safest routes to a road or town nearby. I started rationing food more strictly, just in case I had to leave in a hurry. The isolation had transformed into something heavier, something oppressive. I felt hunted, though I had no proof of anyone being there. I began noticing patterns. The sounds, the slight movements in the brush, they followed a rhythm. Someone was testing me, seeing how I would react. I could not tell if it was a stranger, a hiker with poor judgment, or even an animal that had learned to mimic certain noises. The uncertainty made it worse. Sleep became impossible. I would stay up, flashlight in hand, scanning the edges of the forest, trying to detect the slightest movement. On the 5th day, my patience ran thin. I had fortified the cabin as best I could, with furniture against the doors and boards over the windows. I collected water and food in case I needed to leave in the night. I realized that if someone came, I had to be ready. I even sharpened a stick to use as a weapon, not for hunting, but for protection. I was no longer just on a quiet retreat. I was preparing for survival. The next morning, I noticed tracks leading away from the cabin. They were too large and deliberate to be an animal. I followed them cautiously, noting that they seemed to crisscross the area, never far from the cabin, like a perimeter had been set around me. Panic threatened to overtake me, but I focused on observation. If I could identify the pattern, perhaps I could plan an escape. The tracks suggested someone had been coming and going, timing themselves carefully to avoid being seen, but close enough that I would notice signs if I looked carefully. That night, I stayed alert. I had reinforced the doors and windows, had my flashlight ready, and my stick sharpened. I lay in the loft, staring into the darkness, listening. The forest was quiet, too quiet, and that silence was heavier than any sound. Hours passed. Then, finally, the softest crunch of leaves reached my ears. Someone was there, not far from the cabin. My heart raced, and I gripped the stick, my knuckles white. The sounds moved around the cabin, testing, probing. But then, finally, after what felt like hours, the noise faded. The person had gone or perhaps retreated. I did not sleep at all that night, instead watching, waiting, every nerve alert. I realized that the only way to end this safely was to leave. Staying meant someone could return at any time, and I would be trapped. I packed quickly at dawn, making sure to leave nothing behind, and slipped out the back, moving silently along the trail I had explored days earlier. I kept low, avoiding open spaces, using trees and brush for cover. My pace was steady, but I did not stop until I reached the road. When I finally saw a car approaching in the distance, my body shook with relief. I had made it out, alive, without confrontation. The drive back was surreal. Every sound outside the car felt magnified, every shadow suspicious. I called my friends as soon as I reached town, letting them know I was safe. The cabin trip, which had started as an adventure, had become a test of vigilance, endurance, and courage. Afterward, I returned once during the day with authorities to inspect the cabin. They found signs of human activity, trampled soil, broken branches, but no one had been living there permanently. It was clear someone had been stalking the area, moving carefully to avoid detection. That knowledge was chilling, but at least it explained the sounds and disturbances. The fear I had felt was real, but I had survived because I stayed alert, kept my wits, and chose to leave rather than confront blindly. I never thought a simple weekend in the woods could turn into something so tense, so suffocating, that I felt trapped in my own mind as much as I was trapped in that cabin. I had been planning this trip for months. Just me, a small backpack, and a cabin far enough from the nearest road that the world outside could not reach me. I told myself it was for peace, to escape the constant noise of the city, the endless stream of emails, traffic, and the stress that built up like layers of dust in my mind. The cabin was small, made of rough wood, with a stone chimney and a steep roof that cut against the gray sky. The nearest neighbor was nearly 2 miles away, and the only real connection to the outside world was a small dirt path that twisted through the dense forest. When I arrived, The forest smelled damp and earthy, the air cold and heavy with moisture. It was early afternoon, and the sun was already low, pushing through the trees in soft streaks of orange and gold. I parked my car at the edge of the clearing and lugged my bag along the narrow path, feeling the weight of it in my shoulders. By the time I reached the cabin, I was sweaty and tired, but the sight of the small wooden door and the thick smoke curling from the chimney made a strange kind of relief settle over me. Someone had been here recently. The cabin wasn't abandoned, but it wasn't crowded either. I didn't mind. The cabin itself was bare bones. A small living area with a stone fireplace, a kitchen corner with a sink and a couple of cabinets, and a loft above that served as the sleeping area. The air inside smelled faintly of wood smoke and something old, like the cabin had been shut for a while but not entirely empty. I dropped my bag near the door, ran my hand along the wooden walls, and let myself breathe in the quiet. I unpacked slowly, placing my essentials neatly on the counter and making sure my small camping stove and a few canned goods were ready. I liked order, especially in situations where I knew I would be alone for the next few days. By evening, the light outside had dimmed enough that shadows filled the corners of the room. I lit the fireplace and stacked logs carefully, listening to the hiss and pop as the flames caught. I had brought a few books, some food, and a small lantern in case I wanted to read after dark. The first night passed quietly, though the sounds of the forest pressed close to the cabin. Branches scraping, the distant thump of falling wood, and the occasional rustle that made me glance toward the windows. I slept lightly, waking more than once to listen, to make sure nothing had wandered close. The second day started bright and crisp. I decided to explore the area around the cabin. There was a small creek not far from the clearing, its water moving quietly over stones and fallen branches. The ground was wet in places, mud clinging to my boots as I walked. I noticed tracks near the water. Animal prints, probably deer or maybe a larger predator. I didn't think much of it, but I noted their direction and depth. It struck me how much quieter everything seemed here compared to the city. Even my own movements felt amplified, echoing in the stillness. By late afternoon, I had collected some firewood and stacked it carefully by the side of the cabin. The forest seemed to grow darker earlier than expected, and the clouds had thickened, muting the sunset into gray. When I returned inside, I felt a creeping unease. The cabin seemed smaller somehow, more confining. I double-checked the windows and the door locks. Everything was fine. Nothing had changed, and yet the quiet had become heavier, pressing against my ears, my skin, my chest. I ate a simple dinner of canned beans and bread, sipping cold water from my bottle, and watched the fire. The shadows danced along the walls, throwing shapes that seemed almost like movement. My mind tried to dismiss them, telling me it was just the flames, just the wood, just my imagination. But the feeling lingered, a subtle, gnawing awareness that I was not entirely alone. Night fell fully, and I lit the lantern. I could hear the forest in layers, the wind brushing the treetops, the distant call of a bird, the shift of something moving closer. It wasn't a howl, not exactly, but it was deliberate, cautious, deliberate again. I told myself it was probably a fox or raccoon, something curious that would leave soon. I made sure my knife and flashlight were close by and went to the loft to sleep, layering blankets in preparation for the cold. Around midnight, I woke to a sound that made my stomach knot. It was faint at first, a scraping at the door, almost soft enough to be ignored. Then it became clearer, deliberate. Someone or something was at the cabin. My first instinct was disbelief. Surely it was a branch or a fallen piece of wood. But the sound persisted. Soft steps scraping against the wooden frame of the door. My heart pounded. I stayed as still as I could, holding my breath, listening. It moved to the side window, then paused. The forest outside was black, the trees swaying gently in the wind, and yet I knew someone was out there, watching, testing the boundaries. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I kept the flashlight in one hand, the knife in the other, and sat on the edge of the loft, staring into the darkness outside. The scraping continued intermittently, fading and returning, never constant, but enough to keep my senses sharpened to a painful edge. By dawn, the first light of day gave me a small sense of relief, though my body trembled with exhaustion and fear. The next day, I decided I couldn't stay still. I had to investigate to understand what was happening, or at least to secure the cabin better. I checked all the doors and windows, moving furniture to block entrances and making sure nothing could be forced open easily. I built rudimentary barriers, improvised alarms with cans and string, anything to alert me if someone tried to enter. I felt ridiculous, perhaps, but the instinct to survive was stronger than pride. I stayed vigilant, moving slowly through the cabin, listening to every sound, aware of the wind, the creak, the distant movements of animals, and the unmistakable feeling of someone outside, waiting. By the second night, the reality of my isolation hit me fully. I had no signal on my phone, no immediate way to contact anyone, no assurance that anyone would come looking for me soon. I was alone in a forest that felt increasingly vast and unknowable. The scraping noises returned, closer this time, brushing against the cabin as if testing its limits. I stayed awake again, flashlight in hand, heart hammering, until the gray light of dawn finally broke the night spell. That morning, I decided I had to act, not just wait. I packed supplies into my bag carefully. Food, water, flashlight, knife, matches, rope. I would leave the cabin, move toward the nearest main road, and find safety. As I stepped outside, the forest looked deceptively calm, the sun painting gentle light over the trees, but every step carried tension. I moved slowly, listening for movement, aware that whoever or whatever had been at the cabin could still be nearby. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. The idea of a cabin deep in the woods, far away from people, traffic, and noise, had drawn me like a magnet. I needed the silence, the solitude, and, secretly, the challenge. I had been on hikes before, had camped a few times, but this was different. I wanted to test myself. No phone signal, no visitors, no shortcuts. Just me and the woods, with only a cabin to rely on. The drive itself had been long and tiring. I left the main road early in the morning, the sun barely above the horizon. The map was old. The GPS refused to work as soon as the paved roads ended, and the last stretch to the cabin became a dirt track that twisted and turned sharply through dense forest. The trees grew so close that, at some points, I had to slow down to avoid scraping the car against branches. By the time I reached the small clearing where the cabin stood, the sun was already falling behind the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. The cabin was small but solid, built from thick logs and weathered from years of wind and rain. The porch sagged slightly in the middle, and the steps creaked when I climbed them. The windows were dirty, covered with a thin layer of dust and spider webs, but I could see that the inside had basic furnishings. A small table, a couple of chairs, a stove, and a bed in the corner. There was a stack of firewood neatly piled near the wall, a hint that someone had been maintaining it, at least occasionally. I parked the car beside the cabin and unloaded my bag, which contained supplies for the next 5 days. I had food, water, a first aid kit, lanterns, extra batteries, and a small axe. The idea of being self-sufficient was part of the appeal, but I also knew the woods could be unforgiving. I unpacked quietly, listening to the occasional crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, and the distant sound of a creek. That first night was uneasy, though I didn't recognize it immediately. I built a fire in the stove, lit a lantern, and sat down with my journal. The forest was dark and silent in a way that city people like me weren't used to. No cars, no voices, just the whisper of trees and the faint calls of distant birds. I tried to relax, but each small sound, the thump of something falling in the distance, the scraping of a branch against the cabin wall, made me tense. I told myself it was normal. Animals, wind, my imagination. Sleep was fitful. I woke several times during the night, convinced I had heard someone outside. When I finally got up and peered through the grimy window, I saw only the dense forest. No footprints, no light, nothing. Still, the fear lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, but the thought that someone could be out there, just beyond the tree line, refused to leave. The next morning, I decided to explore the area. I had brought a map, though it was rudimentary, and I wanted to familiarize myself with the paths, the creek, and any potential hazards. I walked through the forest slowly, noting fallen trees, animal tracks, and patches of thick underbrush. Around midday, I returned to the cabin to rest and have lunch. That was when I first noticed it. The tracks. They were faint at first, half hidden in the undergrowth, but unmistakable. Footprints. Human footprints. Not large, but adult-sized, and they led from the forest edge toward the cabin. I froze, trying to convince myself they could be old, perhaps a hiker or a ranger, but something about them felt deliberate, too straight, too purposeful. My heart started beating faster, and I examined the ground more closely. They ended near the cabin door. I felt my stomach drop. I spent the rest of the afternoon reinforcing the cabin door, moving chairs and a small table against it. I checked my phone signal again. Still nothing. I considered driving back to the main road, but the thought of navigating that dirt track at night, alone, unsettled me even more. Instead, I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was probably just some hunter or camper passing by. Night came again, and this time the cabin felt smaller, tighter, almost oppressive. I lit a fire in the stove and kept a knife nearby. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and I swore I could hear footsteps crunching on the leaves outside. My mind tried to rationalize. Branches, animals, the wind. But the sound was too regular, too heavy to be random. I stopped trying to write in my journal and just listened. Hours passed. The sound disappeared, leaving only silence and my own uneven breathing. By the third day, the tension had not eased. I decided to leave the cabin for a longer hike, moving toward the creek and deeper trails. I wanted to check the surroundings, to be aware of every possible approach. The forest was denser than I expected, and navigation was difficult. I marked trees with small scratches of my knife to make a path back, but still I felt on edge. The thought of someone following me kept gnawing at my mind. When I returned to the cabin that afternoon, I noticed something worse. The door, which I had carefully reinforced, was slightly ajar. I hadn't heard it during my walk. My heart raced as I entered slowly, scanning every corner. Nothing appeared missing, nothing disturbed inside. Yet I knew someone had been here. I couldn't see any footprints leading away from the cabin, just the faint impression of steps on the soft dirt near the porch. Panic set in. I decided I needed a plan, not just for tonight, but for the rest of my stay. I gathered all the tools I had: the axe, a large kitchen knife, and even a heavy cast iron pan. I moved furniture in front of doors and windows and settled near the stove, where I could see the front door clearly. I barely slept that night, every creak, every whisper of wind setting my nerves on fire. I had been planning this trip for months, alone in the woods, in a cabin I had rented through a small local listing. The place was far from any town, tucked deep into a forest that the map said was mostly untouched. I told myself this was a way to disconnect, to finally be away from everything, but looking back, I realize now that the solitude I craved was also part of what made the experience so unnerving. The drive to the cabin had been long. Gravel roads turned into dirt paths, and eventually the path was nothing more than ruts cut into the forest floor. My car, loaded with a backpack, food, a first aid kit, some water, and a few basic tools, seemed enormous compared to the narrow trail I was following. I noticed that the trees grew taller and closer together as I drove, the light thinning, giving the forest an almost solid wall of green around me. The air smelled damp, earthy, and thick, and every so often, a bird would burst into flight, startling me. I arrived at the cabin just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. It was small, made of old wood, with a tin roof and a single chimney. The windows were dusty and looked out at the dense trees, and the porch sagged slightly under its own weight. It was not luxurious by any means, but it was exactly what I wanted. Isolated, quiet, and completely mine for a few days. I spent the first hour unloading my supplies, arranging the cabin to my liking. The interior was simple. A small kitchen with a wood stove, a table, a single bed in a corner, and a few chairs. There was no electricity and no running water beyond a small tap outside, but I had brought enough water for drinking and cooking. I lit the stove, which was a small ritual in itself, feeling the warmth slowly fill the cabin. The sun had gone down completely by the time I finished, and the forest outside turned a deep black. That first night was relatively calm. I cooked a simple dinner, ate it slowly, and then lit a small lantern. The sounds of the forest were all around me. Crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, and something heavier moving in the distance. I told myself it was a deer, a raccoon, or perhaps a fox. I read a book for a while, but the quiet was overwhelming. Sleep came late, and I woke several times during the night at the smallest noises, convinced something was outside my cabin. The next day, I decided to explore the immediate area around the cabin. There was a small clearing in front of it, and a path that disappeared into the trees. I walked slowly, my boots crunching on leaves and twigs. I noticed subtle signs of wildlife, broken branches, animal tracks, and the remains of a bird that had clearly been caught by something. The deeper I went, the more I felt a pressure, like the forest itself was watching. I reminded myself that I had been here before, hiking in isolated areas, and that the feeling was normal. That night, however, changed everything. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of a branch snapping, very close to the cabin. My heart began to race. I froze, straining to hear more. There was another snap, then a series of quieter rustling noises. I reminded myself that it could be a deer or some other animal, but the sound kept moving, circling the cabin, and I realized it was not just random wandering. It was deliberate. I felt trapped, the cabin suddenly seeming smaller and more fragile than it had during the day. I grabbed the small hatchet I had brought for emergencies, holding it tightly while trying to calm my breathing. The noises went on for hours. Sometimes they would stop completely, leaving the cabin in an almost suffocating silence, only to start again. At some point, I remember crawling out to the porch just to check, flashlight in hand. I scanned the tree line, the beam cutting through darkness, but saw nothing. The forest seemed endless, shadowed and indifferent. By morning, exhaustion had left me numb. I debated leaving immediately, but I reminded myself I had no cell service and would be risking getting lost if I drove the dirt paths in daylight without any plan. I decided to stay, at least until I had a clearer idea of my surroundings. I tried to rationalize the previous night. Wild animals, my imagination, maybe even fatigue, but a deep unease had settled in my chest, like a physical weight. The following day, I decided to explore farther. I packed water, food, and a small knife, taking the trail that seemed to continue deeper into the forest. At first, it was peaceful. The sun pierced the canopy in scattered beams, birds flitted from branch to branch, and the smell of damp earth and pine was strong. But after about an hour, the trail became less obvious, almost non-existent. I noticed broken branches, flattened areas of grass, and tracks that didn't look like anything I recognized. I began to suspect another human presence, though the tracks were vague and intermittent. I pressed on, telling myself that the rational explanation was someone else hiking, perhaps a hunter. But then I saw the remnants of a fire, long burned out, with scraps of metal nearby that had clearly been handled. I realized that whoever had been here might still be nearby, and a chill ran through me. I retraced my steps quickly, my eyes scanning constantly. When I reached the cabin, the relief was immense, but fleeting. That night, the noises returned, closer this time. Not just around the edges of the cabin, but underneath it, scratching against the wooden floor. I had never been so alert in my life. I spent hours listening, trying to determine what it could be. Finally, I understood. It wasn't an animal. The movements were too heavy, deliberate, and too consistent. Someone had been watching, maybe even waiting. I realized I needed a plan if this continued. I reinforced the windows and doors as best I could with whatever furniture and tools I had, and kept the hatchet by my side. The next day, I decided to leave. I packed quickly, ignoring everything else in the cabin, and made my way to the car. The path, which had seemed familiar before, now felt alien. Every snapping twig, every rustle made me jump. I moved faster, almost running. I couldn't see anyone, but the sense of being followed never left me. By late afternoon, I reached the road and my car. Relief flooded through me as I started the engine. I drove slowly, constantly scanning the edges of the forest. On a narrow bend, I caught movement in my rearview mirror. A figure, tall, thin, walking at the edge of the tree line. My pulse quickened. I drove faster, hands tight on the wheel, never taking my eyes off the mirror. It didn't move much, but it didn't leave either. I reached the nearest small town as the sun set. I stopped at a gas station, catching my breath and trying to calm my hands. The clerk looked at me strangely as I refilled my tank, probably noticing the wild, exhausted look in my eyes. I didn't wait for anything else. I drove straight to the main highway and eventually back to the city, where I locked my apartment door behind me and sat on the floor, trying to process what had happened. In the days that followed, I learned a few things. The forest where the cabin was located had a history of illegal hunting and squatting. People would sometimes set up temporary shelters, living off the land without anyone noticing. Some were violent, territorial, and desperate. I realized that what I had experienced was a brush with one of those people, a confrontation of opportunity and fear. They had probably been watching me, deciding whether I was a threat, and I had gotten lucky by leaving when I did. I never went back to the cabin. I sold my gear and avoided the remote woods entirely. But the memory stayed with me. The quiet of the forest, the sound of movement around the cabin, and the deep, instinctual fear of being trapped with another human who could do anything. It changed the way I looked at isolation. I understood, in a way I had never before, that the forest is not empty, and sometimes the real danger isn't wild animals or the cold. It's the people you don't see waiting. Even months later, when I'm in a crowded city, I still feel it sometimes. The subtle sensation that someone is just out of view, watching, waiting. It's not a fear of ghosts or monsters, just the understanding that human nature can be unpredictable, that desperation and opportunity can combine in ways that leave no time for rational thought. I carry that caution with me now. The experience taught me to respect isolation, to respect wilderness, and to recognize that survival isn't about bravery or skill alone. It's about understanding your environment, knowing the people around you, and being prepared for the reality that you may not be alone, even when you think you are. I had been driving all day, the tires crunching against the gravel road that led deeper into the mountains. The sun was dipping behind jagged peaks, painting the sky in streaks of orange and red. I had planned this trip for months, a solo retreat in a cabin I had rented off a small online listing. It promised isolation, quiet, and a chance to escape the constant noise of life back in the city. But as I drove the last few miles on the winding, narrow road, the trees seemed to close in around me. The shadows of pine and spruce stretched across the path like fingers reaching for the car. I told myself it was just my imagination, or the fatigue from hours behind the wheel, but a creeping unease settled in my chest. The cabin appeared suddenly, almost hidden among the trees. It was older than I expected, a two-story wooden structure with weathered planks and a steep roof darkened by years of rain and snow. There was no other building in sight, just forest. A thin layer of mist hovered near the ground, and the only sound was the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. I parked on the uneven dirt driveway, the engine of the car dying with a final sputter that echoed in the silence. I stepped out, the cold air immediately biting at my face, carrying the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves. I opened the cabin door, and a faint creak announced my entrance. The interior smelled of dust and old wood, the kind of smell that makes you cough slightly when you take a deep breath. The cabin was furnished sparsely. There was a small kitchen area, a table with a couple of chairs, a wood stove with a stack of logs beside it, and a living area with a worn couch and a rickety bookshelf filled with faded paperbacks. Upstairs, I could see the outline of two bedrooms through the railings. Everything looked functional but neglected. The sense of isolation was heavy, almost tangible, pressing on my chest as I moved through the rooms. I unpacked my bag slowly, deliberately, trying to keep my mind off the way the shadows seemed to move as the light from the setting sun faded. I started a small fire in the stove, the sound of cracking wood filling the cabin and the smell of smoke mixing with the damp odor of the room. It was comforting, familiar, but even as I lit the fire, I felt a slight chill in the back of my neck, as though someone or something had been watching me from the corner of the room. I shook it off and prepared a simple dinner, trying to focus on the mundane tasks. The first night was restless. Every creak of the wooden floors, every branch scraping against the side of the cabin, seemed amplified in the quiet. I kept imagining shadows moving outside the windows, though each time I looked, there was nothing but trees. Around midnight, I heard something more distinct, a thud from outside, soft but deliberate. My heart started pounding. I told myself it was an animal, probably a deer or a raccoon, but the rational explanation didn't stop the sudden cold sweat from forming on my back. I stayed awake for hours, sitting by the fire, listening to the night, until exhaustion finally forced me to sleep. The next morning, I ventured outside to inspect the surroundings. The forest was dense, the trees towering over me, and the cabin seemed swallowed by the wilderness. I saw tracks in the dirt, large and uneven, that led from the back of the cabin toward the woods. My stomach tightened. They didn't look like deer tracks. They were bigger, more human-shaped, and the spacing was uneven, like someone had been walking cautiously. I took a deep breath and reminded myself it could be a hiker, though I hadn't seen any signs of other people. The thought of someone else being nearby didn't calm me. It made the isolation feel more threatening. I decided to spend the day preparing the cabin further, stacking more wood, checking the locks on the doors and windows, and making sure my emergency supplies were within reach. I kept glancing out the windows, half expecting to see movement, but there was nothing. Still, the feeling of being watched didn't fade. It followed me even into the small, cozy corners I had tried to make feel like home. By nightfall, the unease had grown. The wind picked up, rattling the windows and shaking the trees. I ate quickly, then sat by the stove listening. That's when I heard it again. A slow, deliberate scraping at the side of the cabin. My stomach sank. It wasn't like the soft rustle of branches in the wind. This was deliberate. Something was moving near the cabin. My first instinct was to check the perimeter, but every instinct screamed at me to stay inside. I grabbed the largest kitchen knife I could find and moved quietly to the window. The darkness outside was thick, impenetrable. I strained my eyes, trying to see movement, but all I could hear was my own breathing and the occasional snap of twigs. Hours passed. The scraping stopped for a while, only to start again, slower, closer. I couldn't see anything, but I could sense presence. My mind raced with possibilities: wild animal, intruder, maybe even someone lost in the woods. I felt my hands tremble as I gripped the knife. Sleep was impossible. I spent the night in short, tense bursts of dozing, waking at every small sound. The following morning, I decided I needed to leave. I packed quickly, my heart racing, and went to the car. The tracks I had seen before were still there, now more numerous, circling the cabin. My stomach dropped. Whoever or whatever had been there was still around. I tried to start the engine, but it coughed and died. Panic set in. I checked the gas, plenty. Battery seemed fine. I tried again. The engine refused. My mind ran through worst-case scenarios. I could leave on foot, but the forest was dense, and I had no idea which way to go. Then I heard it. A branch snapping close behind me, followed by soft, deliberate footsteps approaching. My pulse jumped. I ran back into the cabin, locking the door, barricading it with furniture. I could hear movement outside, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. My breathing was harsh and rapid, my fingers trembling. I tried to calm myself, telling myself to think logically. There had to be a rational explanation, but every shadow outside the window, every sound, suggested otherwise. Hours passed. I rationed my water, moving only when I needed to use the bathroom or check the windows. Whoever was outside didn't make any noise for long periods, but I could feel them there, circling. I didn't know if they were armed, or if they intended to hurt me, but I couldn't take the chance. I spent that night huddled in the corner of the living room, knife in hand, trying to stay quiet. Morning came, but it offered no relief. The tracks were still around the cabin. I realized I needed a plan. Staying inside indefinitely wasn't an option. I remembered a small dirt path that led further down the mountain. It was steep and treacherous, but it might lead to a road. I packed essentials into a backpack: water, food, first aid kit, flashlight, and prepared to leave at first light. I had no way to communicate with anyone. The cell signal was non-existent. I waited until the sun rose fully, casting light across the forest floor, before making my move. Every step was deliberate and careful, trying not to make noise. My heart raced with every rustle and snap of twigs. I kept checking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. The forest seemed endless, oppressive, and I moved as quietly as possible, using the trees for cover. The backpack weighed heavily on my shoulders, and my legs ached from the steep incline and uneven terrain. Hours passed, and I stumbled through thick underbrush, past fallen logs and dense patches of ferns. I stayed alert for tracks, listening for movement. I didn't hear anything following me, but I didn't dare relax. By late afternoon, I emerged from the denser part of the forest and saw a small dirt road below. Relief washed over me. I ran downhill, hoping to reach civilization. My legs were screaming, my lungs burned, but adrenaline carried me forward. I finally reached a small country road. Cars were rare, but I managed to flag one down. The driver looked concerned but agreed to take me to the nearest town. The sense of safety was overwhelming. I explained as best I could to the authorities about the tracks in the cabin, but with no evidence, it was difficult for them to take action. They did, however, advise me not to return alone. I never went back to that cabin. Weeks later, I learned from local reports that a transient had been living in the woods nearby, known to follow cabins and scare away visitors to avoid being caught. The description matched what I had felt during those nights. I realized how close I had come to a real danger, one that wasn't supernatural, one that relied purely on human malice and isolation. Even now, whenever I drive past forests or hear a noise in the dark, I remember that cabin. I remember the cold, the shadows, and the suffocating feeling of being watched. The experience changed me. I learned to respect isolation, to always have an exit plan, and to trust instincts over comfort. The cabin itself, abandoned and weathered, remained in my memory as a place of tension and fear, but the lesson it left me was clear. Survival depends on awareness, caution, and action, not luck. I rebuilt my sense of safety slowly, taking trips closer to civilization at first, always with a friend. Eventually, I returned to wilderness areas, but never in total isolation. That cabin, that small patch of forest, had tested me in ways I never imagined, but I survived. And survival, I realized, wasn't about being brave. It was about paying attention, being ready, and moving decisively when danger came. I had been planning this trip for months, meticulously choosing the cabin, the location, and the time of year. I wanted solitude, the kind of isolation that only the dense forests and remote mountains could offer. The kind of silence where even your own breathing feels loud. I had found a small cabin listed online, far from the nearest road, hidden deep in a thick forest. The reviews were sparse, but what few existed mentioned peace, quiet, and nature like nothing else. That's what I wanted, that's what I thought I needed. The drive itself was long, winding through narrow roads that twisted between tall pines and rocky cliffs. The further I went, the more the trees closed in on the road, and the sunlight barely touched the asphalt. At first, I didn't mind. I enjoyed the feeling of leaving the world behind, of turning off my phone, my notifications, everything. But as the road narrowed further and potholes became more frequent, I realized just how isolated this place was. There were no signs of houses, no other cars, no sound but the occasional bird or the wind rustling the branches. I remember gripping the steering wheel tighter, a small knot of unease forming in my stomach, but I pushed it aside. This was normal. This was part of the adventure. When I finally reached the turnoff for the cabin, it was nothing more than a faint dirt trail barely wide enough for my car. The tires crunched over loose gravel, and I had to slow to a crawl to avoid the deep ruts and exposed roots. I kept my eyes on the trail, but my mind wandered to the possibility of wildlife. Bears, maybe a wolf or two, even though the listings said they were rare. Still, it didn't feel dangerous yet. It just felt far away from everything, and that was exactly why I was here. The cabin itself was smaller than I expected. A single-story wooden structure, with faded paint, a sagging porch, and windows that reflected the surrounding forest like dark mirrors. The air smelled of old wood, damp earth, and pine needles. There was a thin layer of dust over the floorboards, but the place seemed structurally sound. There were basic furnishings inside. A small kitchen area, a living space with a few chairs and a worn couch, a table with peeling varnish, and a tiny bedroom with a mattress that looked only slightly better than a sleeping bag. It wasn't luxurious, but it didn't need to be. I had what I came for: solitude. The first day passed quietly. I unpacked, explored the surrounding area, took photographs of the forest, and marveled at the silence. At night, the forest came alive in ways that the day never showed. The rustling of small animals in the underbrush, the distant howl of a coyote, the occasional snap of a branch. It all sounded louder in the absence of human noise. I had a small lantern and a stack of firewood. I kept a fire going that night, watching the flames consume the dry wood while I sat in the quiet. I felt safe, tucked inside the cabin with walls thicker than any thin hotel wall. I fell asleep to the sound of the wind and distant animal calls, content. The next morning, I woke to a strange sound. At first, I thought it was the wind, or maybe a branch hitting the side of the cabin, but it repeated, subtle and rhythmic. A crunch, pause, crunch, pause. I froze and strained my ears. It was coming from outside, near the edge of the trees that bordered the clearing where the cabin sat. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or some other creature moving carefully over the forest floor, but it felt deliberate, slow, calculated. I dressed quickly, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped outside. The morning air was crisp, sharp in my lungs, and the sunlight filtered through the canopy in thin, hazy beams. I scanned the edge of the forest but saw nothing. The sound had stopped. I shook my head and laughed quietly to myself. I had been on edge. It was probably nothing. Nothing ever came close to the cabin. Nothing had approached before. Why would it now? I spent the day hiking a short trail nearby, sticking to areas I could see clearly. The forest was dense. Every direction a wall of trees, undergrowth, and uneven terrain. As I walked, I noticed how easily sound carried in this environment. A bird's call would echo. A branch snapping would seem louder than it should. It made me acutely aware of every movement. I kept thinking about the sound from the morning, and a small knot of unease returned. I chalked it up to being alone in the wilderness, being hyper-aware. Still, I made sure to stick to the trail and return to the cabin by late afternoon. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I started the fire again. I wanted to relax, watch the flames, and shake off the creeping anxiety. The forest grew dark quickly once the sun fell, and soon the only light was the warm glow from the cabin and the soft flicker of the fire. I could hear everything now. A woodpecker drumming somewhere far off, the scurrying of animals in the underbrush, even the faint whistle of the wind through the trees. Then I heard it again, that same slow, deliberate crunching, this time from closer than before. My stomach dropped. It came from the tree lean behind the cabin, the side opposite the clearing where I had parked the car. I froze. The fire seemed to dim, though I knew it hadn't. My hands gripped the edge of the table as I tried to convince myself it was an animal. But the sound didn't move away. It moved parallel to the cabin, careful and steady, not random like an animal searching for food. I remembered the stories I had read about isolated cabins. Most were harmless, but some involved people who lived in isolation or wandered into the forest. Trespassers, hunters, and worse. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone was nearby, camping, hiking, lost, but the area was remote and the last known trailhead was a mile back. No one should be here. I considered going out to check, but my mind screamed that it would be a mistake. Instead, I made sure all doors were locked, all windows secured, and I kept the fire going, ready to make noise if necessary. Hours passed slowly. I sat with my back to the wall, watching the shadows shift with the firelight. The sound returned periodically, always outside, always moving. I couldn't see anything through the darkness. My imagination ran wild. I imagined every scenario. Someone watching me from the trees, someone waiting for night to fall to approach, someone lost but dangerous. My heart raced. Every small sound, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, made me jump. The night stretched on, endless and tense. By dawn, the forest had quieted. The crunching sounds stopped, and the first rays of sunlight illuminated the cabin and the surrounding clearing. I felt a small sense of relief but not safety. I was alone, in a place with no easy escape, and last night had proven that I wasn't as isolated as I thought. I spent the morning carefully inspecting the cabin, looking for signs of anyone having approached. There were footprints in the dirt near the back tree-line, small, careful, leading from the edge of the forest toward the cabin and then back into the trees. No one had tried to enter, but the proximity was enough to make my nerves taut. I spent the next day focused on what I could control, gathering more firewood, making sure I had water, securing the perimeter as best I could. I stayed inside after dark, keeping the fire alive and my flashlight close. I slept little, only dozing for short periods. Every sound outside made me flinch. By the third night, I felt exhaustion pressing in. My body was drained, my mind tense, and I started feeling paranoia creep into my thoughts. Every branch snapping sounded deliberate. Every shadow in the tree-line seemed like a person waiting. Couldn't shake it. I had to leave. The next morning, I packed quickly, loaded my car, and double-checked every lock before stepping outside. The forest was still, almost eerily quiet. I got in the car and drove slowly back toward the main road, eyes scanning the tree-line, every shadow and shape putting me on high alert. When I finally reached the highway, I felt a rush of relief I didn't expect. The solitude I had sought had turned into fear, and the forest that had seemed beautiful now seemed oppressive and threatening. Later, I learned that people sometimes camped illegally in that forest, living off the land, sometimes stalking the rare visitors who ventured too far off the beaten path. The cabin was well hidden, but not unknown. Someone had been near, observing, testing the waters, waiting. I realized how easily the isolation I had craved could have become a trap. I never returned. I never even told anyone the exact location. The memory stayed with me, a constant reminder of how fragile our sense of safety can be, and how isolation can shift from peace to fear in a heartbeat. Even months later, the feeling of being watched, of hearing that crunch outside the cabin, lingered in my mind. I couldn't go back to the same kind of solitude without that memory shadowing me. I understood now that nature was indifferent, but people could be far more dangerous than any bear or wolf. And that lesson stayed with me longer than the fear of anything else I had ever experienced. I drove up the narrow dirt road that led deep into the forest, the tires crunching over gravel and small stones. The air was thick with the smell of wet pine and decaying leaves. I had been looking forward to a quiet weekend alone in a cabin I had rented through a local site. The listing promised solitude, a cozy retreat in the wilderness, and no neighbors for miles. I thought it sounded perfect, a place to escape work, emails, and the constant hum of city life. But as I drove further, the silence of the forest began to press in around me, almost physically. No birds, no rustling animals, just the sound of the engine and my own breathing. The sun was low in the sky, turning the sky orange and then pink as I turned a bend and the cabin finally came into view. It was smaller than I had imagined, a single-story structure of rough-hewn wood with a slanted tin roof. Moss and dark stains from years of rain covered parts of the exterior. The porch creaked under my weight as I got out to stretch, and I noticed the door had a simple padlock on it. The owner had said they would leave a key in a hidden spot nearby, which I found tucked under a stone by the steps. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The the air smelling faintly of mildew and wood smoke. The interior was rustic but livable. There was a small kitchen area with a propane stove, a sink, and a fridge that hummed quietly. A single room served as the living area with a wood-burning stove, a couch that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in months, and a narrow staircase leading up to a loft. The loft had a thin mattress on the floor and a small window looking out into the trees. I set my bag down, unpacked a few essentials, and decided to explore the area around the cabin. The sun was dipping below the treetops, casting long shadows across the clearing. I could hear the wind moving through the trees, a low, constant whistle. It felt isolated, more isolated than I had imagined, but I told myself that was the point. I wanted quiet, and the forest provided it. I took a few photos on my phone, noting the wild undergrowth, the uneven ground, and the small creek that ran behind the cabin. The water looked cold and clear, reflecting the last streaks of sunset. That night, I built a small fire in the stove. The smell of burning wood filled the cabin, warming the room. I cooked some canned soup and ate slowly, listening to the occasional crack of wood settling in the cabin and the whisper of wind through the broken branches outside. Around midnight, I noticed a sound outside the window, a soft scratching like something brushing against wood. I froze, listening. My first thought was a tree branch, but the sound was too deliberate. It moved from one side of the cabin to the other, slow and careful. My heart rate spiked. I had been alone, but now I realized how thin the walls were, how exposed the cabin felt. I got up and peeked through the curtains. There was nothing, just darkness, thick and impenetrable. The creek glimmered faintly under moonlight, and the trees swayed slightly in the wind. I tried to reason with myself, telling myself it was an animal, a raccoon, maybe a deer, but the scratching continued intermittently around the perimeter of the cabin. I grabbed a flashlight and carefully opened the door. The cold night air hit me immediately, sharp and bitter. I shone the light across the clearing. Nothing, just the undergrowth and trees, swaying slightly. But then I saw tracks. Fresh tracks, human-sized, leading from the tree-line to the cabin and back. My stomach dropped. I hadn't seen another car on the way in, and the nearest road was a mile away. Panic rose, but I told myself to stay calm. I checked the locks on all the windows and doors, even though I had locked them before. Everything was secure. I turned off all the lights and went to bed in the loft, pulling the thin blanket over me. Every sound seemed amplified, the rustling leaves, the creak of the cabin settling, even the occasional drip of water from the roof. I tried to sleep but couldn't. I kept imagining someone crouched just outside, waiting. I stayed awake until dawn, my eyes fixed on the small window of the loft, straining to see movement. Nothing happened. The first light of morning was almost a relief. I decided to explore further during the day, convincing myself that light would make me safer. I packed a small bag with water, a map, and a pocket knife, and followed the creek upstream. The forest was dense, the ground uneven, and I had to duck under branches constantly. I noticed more tracks, sometimes paired with broken twigs or flattened undergrowth, suggesting someone, or something, had moved through recently. I followed the tracks until they ended abruptly at a small, muddy clearing. There was a makeshift campfire, long cold, and several footprints surrounding it. Whoever had been here was experienced, careful, and likely watching the cabin while I slept. I returned quickly, my pace hurried. When I reached the cabin, I noticed a new detail. One of the logs forming the corner of the cabin had a faint mark. Scratched letters or numbers, I wasn't sure. I ran my fingers over it, but it was partially covered in dirt. My mind raced. Was this a warning? A marker? Someone had been here before me. That night, I barricaded the door with the heavy kitchen table and moved all sharp objects within reach. I slept in clothes, boots on, with my knife under my pillow, every sound outside making me flinch. The scratching returned, slow at first, then faster, more impatient, circling the cabin. The next morning, I knew I couldn't just stay in the cabin. I had to leave or at least find a safer place. I packed my car with as many essentials as I could carry in one trip. On the way to the road, I stayed on high alert, watching the underbrush for movement. That's when I saw him, a man, standing among the trees, partially hidden, watching me. He was thin, wearing a dark jacket and jeans, and he didn't move as I approached. My pulse shot up. I stopped, trying to act casual, and he didn't flinch. Then, slowly, he turned and walked back into the trees, disappearing entirely. I ran the rest of the way, the forest suddenly oppressive, every sound amplified. When I reached the road, I realized the nearest town was still 15 miles away, and there was no cell service until I got over the next ridge. I jumped into the car, started the engine, and drove as fast as I dared on the dirt road, scanning constantly. Nothing followed me immediately, but I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on my back. The isolation that had seemed peaceful the day before now felt like a trap, a vulnerability I couldn't escape fast enough. Finally, I reached the ridge where cell service returned. I called the local authorities, explained the situation, and gave them the location. They promised to send someone to check the cabin. I stayed in a motel that night, unable to sleep, checking every window, every dark corner, my mind replaying the man in the trees. 2 days later, the authorities called. They had found the cabin empty, but the signs of someone living there recently were undeniable. Footprints, the scratched logs, remnants of a campfire. They advised me not to return. The man had vanished, but they confirmed he had been seen in the area before, living off the grid, moving silently, sometimes watching cabins and hikers. I didn't go back. I sold the remaining days of my rental, got a full refund, and returned home. Took weeks for my nerves to settle. Even now, years later, I still think about that cabin, about the man in the trees, about how quiet the forest can feel when you are truly alone. I don't think I will ever return to a remote cabin in the wilderness. The experience taught me that isolation is not always peaceful. Sometimes it's dangerous and you never know who or what is watching until it's almost too late. I had always loved being alone in the woods, even when it meant going far away from anyone I knew. There was something about the quiet, the smell of wet earth, and the way the trees bent slightly with the wind that made me feel alive. That year, I decided to rent a small cabin in the middle of a dense forest, far from any main roads, far from neighbors, far from the noise of the town where I lived. I had found the cabin online, a tiny wooden structure with a single room and a wood stove, advertised as completely isolated and perfect for a solo retreat. The pictures made it look almost charming, surrounded by tall pine trees and a little creek running nearby. I thought it would be peaceful, a perfect getaway to read, write, and just be away from people for a few days. I packed carefully, making sure I had enough food, water, batteries, and blankets. I brought a small first aid kit, a flashlight, and my phone, though I knew there might be little to no signal. I also brought my old hunting knife, not because I expected to need it, but because it gave me a sense of security. I had driven for hours, down twisting roads with almost no traffic, watching the forest close in on me from both sides, feeling my excitement grow. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked exactly like the pictures. Rough wood, moss growing on the roof, a small porch with a swing that creaked in the wind. I parked my car nearby and unloaded my gear. The first night was quiet, just the kind of quiet I expected. The wind rattled the windows slightly, and the creek made a soft, constant noise. I had a small fire going in the stove, and I could see the flames flickering against the walls. I felt a deep calm, but as the night wore on, I started noticing small things. Branches scratching against the windows, the sound of leaves crunching outside when there was no wind. I chalked it up to animals, deer, raccoons, maybe a fox, but a part of me stayed alert. I reminded myself that this was the wilderness, and small noises were normal. Still, I didn't sleep well. The next day, I explored the area. The forest was thick, full of old trees and thick undergrowth. I walked along the creek, noticed a few animal tracks, and collected firewood. Around late afternoon, I noticed that the area around the cabin seemed different than I remembered when I first drove in. Some of the trees I thought were far away now seemed closer. The path I had taken to gather firewood looked strangely unfamiliar, though I had walked it only hours ago. I felt a little uneasy but assumed I had just been distracted or that the woods were more confusing than I realized. I had never been great with directions. I went back to the cabin, double-checking that the doors were locked and that the firewood was stacked near the stove. That night, the sounds outside felt louder. I could hear twigs snapping, soft thumps, and sometimes what sounded like footsteps circling the cabin. I tried to tell myself it was just animals, but some part of my brain refused to let the idea go. On the third day, I went further into the forest, taking a small backpack with water, snacks, and my knife. I followed a faint trail, though I was careful to mark my path with small piles of stones so I could find my way back. The forest was thick, the sunlight filtering through the leaves creating dark patches. I had been walking for a while when I heard something unusual. A low, scraping sound, like someone or something dragging an object across the ground. My stomach tightened. I froze. The sound stopped. I waited for a few minutes, telling myself it was probably a branch falling, but instinct made me tense. I turned slowly and noticed fresh footprints in the soft soil. They weren't animal prints. They were human, and they were very close. I realized the footprints were circling where I had been standing, like whoever had left them had been watching me. Panic rose in my chest, but I forced myself to remain calm. I quickly turned and retraced my steps, following my stone markers. When I reached the cabin, I felt relief, though it was thin and jittery. I locked the door immediately and checked all the windows. Everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me for hours, maybe from the trees around the cabin. That night, I barely slept. Every noise was amplified, the creak, the wind, the scratching on the walls. I kept my knife close, my flashlight on the nightstand, and every time I heard a movement outside, my heart jumped. I was alone in a place far from anyone, and that was the truth I couldn't escape. The fourth day, I decided not to leave the cabin. I gathered more firewood, cleaned up the inside, and tried to stay busy. The wind picked up in the late afternoon, rattling the windows and shaking the porch swing. I felt trapped inside, and every shadow outside seemed alive. Around nightfall, I heard footsteps again, but this time they were deliberate, heavy, approaching the cabin from the trees. I didn't open the door. I didn't even move. The sound circled the cabin, stopped for a while, then faded. I felt frozen, my mind spinning with every possible scenario. I stayed awake all night, my flashlight beside me, my knife under my pillow, my ears straining for any sign of the footsteps returning. The fifth day, I knew I couldn't just stay inside forever. I had to leave eventually. I packed my things, made sure everything in the cabin was in order, and decided to hike back toward the road I had driven in on. I left early, hoping the daylight would help me navigate. As I walked, I kept checking behind me, scanning the trees. I felt like I was being followed. Occasionally, I saw movement between the trunks, shadows that disappeared when I looked directly. I stayed calm, telling myself it was just my imagination. But when I reached a small clearing, I noticed something chilling. Fresh footprints in a straight line leading from the trees toward me, stopping only a few feet away. My heart pounded. The footprints were large, heavier than mine, and there was something about the spacing that made me certain they were made deliberately, meant to intimidate or track me. I gripped my knife, moved quickly, and didn't look back. I followed my mental map, avoiding obvious paths and trying to stay quiet, but I knew the person, whoever it was, could see me from the cover of the trees. Hours later, I finally reached the road. My car was exactly where I had left it. Relief washed over me, but it was accompanied by exhaustion and a lingering fear that followed me even as I drove away. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone emerging from the trees. There was no one, just the forest, stretching endlessly. I drove back slowly, keeping an eye on the roadside, hyper-aware of every sound, every movement, until I reached the main highway and finally felt safe. In the days that followed, I kept replaying the events in my mind. I thought about what could have happened if I had been slower or if the person had been closer. I realized how lucky I had been that whoever had been watching me didn't approach the cabin directly or try to ambush me on the trail. The forest had been a prison in a way, but it had also been a shield. The isolation I had sought had made me vulnerable, but it had also forced me to stay alert, to rely on my instincts. Eventually, I reported the footprints to the local authorities, though there wasn't much they could do. There had been no sign of forced entry or theft, just someone watching, perhaps waiting for the right moment. They advised me to be careful and avoid the area for a while. I took their advice seriously. I never went back to that cabin. I sold the property online, never told anyone exactly why. But the experience stayed with me. It changed how I viewed solitude, how I moved through nature, and how much I trusted my own instincts. I realized that danger doesn't always announce itself, that sometimes it lurks silently, watching, waiting. And most importantly, I understood how careful one must be when completely alone in a place no one else can reach. Even years later, when I walked through other forests, I couldn't shake the memory of those footsteps circling the cabin, the sense of being watched in silence, the quiet threat that could have ended everything if I had made a single mistake. I remembered the relief of reaching the road, the safety of my car, and the rush of driving back to civilization. I remembered every detail, the rustle of the leaves, the smell of wet pine, the chill in the night air, the weight of fear pressing against me. And I remembered the lesson. Isolation can be beautiful, but it can also be dangerous, and awareness can be the difference between life and death. From that experience, I never took solitude for granted again. I always prepared, always left signals, always kept my senses sharp. I knew now that the woods, as beautiful as they are, hold a quiet danger, and one must respect it fully. The fear I had felt was not a story or a shadow. It was real, tangible, and it had taught me to value life, caution, and the importance of returning safely from the wild. Even now, when I think of that cabin, I remember the peace I sought, the fear I endured, and the clarity I gained. I learned that survival isn't about fighting monsters. It's about noticing the smallest details, trusting instincts, and taking action when it matters. And that knowledge, hard-earned and clear, has stayed with me ever since. I had been driving all day through the winding roads of the northern woods, the sky a dull, gray expanse that promised rain but never delivered. The GPS on my phone kept losing signal, dropping in and out as I maneuvered past thick clusters of trees that seemed to close in around the narrow asphalt path. My plan was simple: a weekend in solitude at a cabin I had rented. The owner's description promised isolation, peace, and a true escape from the world. At first, I had been excited, imagining mornings with fog hanging low in the trees, evenings by the fire, the smell of damp earth mixing with the smoke from the chimney. By the time I turned off the main road onto a rough gravel track, the excitement had turned into a tight knot of anxiety that I tried to shake off. The road was barely wide enough for a single car, littered with potholes and lined by dense forest. It felt as though I was being swallowed into the wilderness, but the cabin was supposed to be there, somewhere at the end of the path. When I finally saw it, the cabin looked much smaller than I had imagined. It was an old wooden structure, faded to a gray-brown by years of sun and snow, leaning slightly as if the weight of the forest had pressed against it over decades. The porch was narrow, the boards creaking under my feet as I stepped out of the car. I could see no sign of life around. No smoke from the chimney, no footprints other than my own, no birds in the branches that surrounded the cabin. The silence was dense, almost tactile. I unpacked quickly, carrying my bag into the cabin and setting it down with a thud on the old wooden floor. The interior smelled of mildew and aged wood. Dust motes floated in the light from the single window, and the air was cool and heavy. Everything was quiet, too quiet. The first thing I noticed was how thin the walls were. Every sound seemed amplified. The groan of the floorboards beneath my steps, the faint rustling of leaves brushing against the windows, the occasional snap of a twig outside. It was disorienting. I tried to distract myself by unpacking, arranging my things, and making a simple dinner of canned soup and bread, but my mind kept wandering to the noises outside. Sometimes it was just the wind or a squirrel jumping in the branches, but sometimes it felt like something larger was moving deliberately, testing the boundaries of the cabin's isolation. The first night, I slept fitfully, waking at odd hours to the sound of scraping against the wooden siding. I told myself it was the forest settling, branches rubbing, or an animal looking for food. But the feeling of being watched never left me. The next morning, I went for a short walk to get my bearings. The forest was thick, the trees close together, and the ground soft from fallen leaves and damp soil. Sunlight barely reached the forest floor, filtered through the dense canopy. I marked a path with small sticks to avoid getting lost, but I didn't venture far. When I returned, I noticed the cabin's front door was slightly ajar. I could have sworn I had locked it the night before. A shiver ran down my spine. I checked the locks, the windows, even the back door. Everything was secure now, but the sense that someone or something had been inside lingered. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps the wind had blown it open, or maybe I had forgotten. Still, the memory of the creak of the door in the night made my stomach churn. Over the next day, I settled into a routine. I gathered firewood, explored the small area around the cabin, and tried to relax. Yet I kept noticing small things out of place. A chair that I had left upright was slightly turned. My backpack, which I had set against the wall, seemed to have shifted. I found footprints in the mud near the cabin, but they weren't human. They were large, wide, the kind that suggested a heavy animal. My thoughts spiraled. There were bears in these woods, sure, but the prints didn't match anything I had seen in guides. Still, I tried to calm myself, telling myself I was imagining things, that my mind was on edge because of the isolation. But when night fell, the noises returned. More persistent this time. Thuds, scratching, sometimes a slow, dragging sound. I kept the fire going, using its warmth as a shield, but the shadows outside grew long and oppressive. By the third day, I had decided to explore further despite my unease. I followed a narrow trail that led down a slope into a valley where a small stream cut through the forest. The water was clear, moving quietly over rocks, and the air smelled of wet moss and pine. It was beautiful, peaceful even, but I was aware that I could not hear any bird calls, any animal sounds. It was too quiet, an unnatural silence that pressed against my ears. I knelt to drink from the stream, watching the water ripple over stones, and for a brief moment, I felt like the cabin's isolation might be bearable. Then I saw the footprints, not in the mud, but etched into the dirt along the stream bank. Deep, wide, uneven, clawed. Someone, or something, had passed through here recently. I froze, listening, but there was nothing. I had a small knife in my pocket, more for utility than defense, but the thought of it in my hand offered a fleeting sense of security. I retraced my steps quickly, trying to keep calm, but my mind raced with possibilities. I had no cell signal. If anything happened, no one would know. Returning to the cabin, I found another unsettling sign. The firewood I had stacked outside was scattered, some pieces broken as if thrown. I felt a sinking sense of dread that tightened my chest. I inspected the area, circling the cabin, checking for signs of human intrusion. There was nothing. No footprints that could be identified as human, no scent of smoke or campfires. Just the broken wood, the marks of something large moving deliberately around the property. I secured the doors again and reinforced the windows with what little I could find inside the cabin, though I knew it was futile against anything truly determined. I spent the night sitting close to the fire, the knife on the table before me, the sounds outside coming in waves of uncertainty. Sometimes, I thought I heard breathing, low and heavy, just beyond the cabin walls. The following day, my unease intensified. I spent it inside, rationing my food and water. I didn't want to leave the cabin, yet I knew I could not stay indefinitely. I began noticing patterns in the sounds outside. A series of thuds followed by scratching, then silence, then a slow approach as if the creature or person was studying me. I realized I had been underestimating the danger. I had thought of bears, maybe a large deer, but the noises had a rhythm, an intentionality that suggested intelligence. I reinforced the doors again, stacking chairs against them, and examined the windows. Every shadow outside seemed to move independently, unconnected to the trees or the wind. I tried to convince myself it was paranoia, but even I could not ignore the deliberate quality of the disturbances. By the 5th day, hunger and dehydration were becoming a concern. I needed to leave, but I also feared what waited beyond the cabin. I spent the morning preparing, wrapping my supplies, marking the path back to the road. I left only a note on the table, a habit I had picked up during solo trips, in case someone ever found me. It was short, factual, listing my name, the cabin, and the date. I knew that leaving the note was a formality. I didn't truly expect it to matter. When I stepped outside, I immediately noticed a figure in the trees. At first, I thought it was a shadow, a trick of the light, but as I focused, I saw the shape. Tall, human-like, partially obscured by branches, watching me. My heart rate spiked. I could see no weapon, but the posture was deliberate, unhurried, confident. I backed toward the cabin, unsure whether to flee or retreat. The figure did not move, but the rustling of the leaves intensified. I grabbed my bag and ran along the rough gravel path, every step careful yet frantic. The figure stayed in the tree-line, maintaining its distance but keeping pace in a way that made my skin crawl. The hours that followed were a blur of running, hiding, and scanning the forest for cover. I avoided the main road at first, sticking to narrow trails, and only ventured near when I was confident I had lost the figure. Every time I paused, I checked behind me. The forest seemed alive with hidden movement. It was exhausting, terrifying, but I pressed on. Eventually, the road appeared again, straight and open, with occasional signs of civilization. Discarded bottles, tire tracks. I ran along it until I saw headlights approaching. I waved frantically, shouting, my voice hoarse and trembling. The car slowed, then stopped, and I collapsed against it, sobbing with relief and terror. The driver called the police, and when they arrived, I described the cabin, the footprints, the figure in the woods. They promised to investigate, though they could offer little beyond that. Weeks later, I returned to the cabin with law enforcement. They found signs of recent human habitation. Footprints, a makeshift camp in the woods behind the cabin, and evidence that someone had been monitoring the cabin for weeks. The figure I had seen was real, a trespasser who had been living in the woods, untraceable and dangerous. The authorities removed the immediate threat, but the memory of those days, the isolation, the sounds, the feeling of being watched, stayed with me. I never returned to that area. The forest kept its secrets, and I learned firsthand how quickly solitude could become a trap, how the thin walls of wood and old locks were no match for someone willing to lurk unseen. The fear was real, and it had almost cost me everything. I learned to appreciate civilization again, the noise, the people, the lights. I kept a small emergency kit, always aware of the danger that lurked just beyond the forest edge. That cabin taught me something harsh. The wilderness is beautiful, but it is indifferent, and human threats are sometimes closer than we imagine. Isolation strips away comfort and security, leaving only instinct, fear, and the will to survive. The memory of those nights, the scratches, the thuds, the silent observer in the trees, stayed with me, a reminder of how fragile safety can be and how quickly the world can close in when we think we are alone. Even now, years later, when I pass a dense forest or drive along an isolated road, I feel a tightening in my chest, a sense that someone is watching. I know it is the lesson of that cabin, the mark it left on me, that the world is vast, sometimes beautiful, sometimes terrifying, and that sometimes we are not as alone as we think. I carry that memory with me, not as a ghost story, not as a legend, but as a warning. I survived, yes, but I emerged changed. I emerged cautious, aware, and with a respect for the quiet power of isolation and the dangers it can hide. I had been planning the cabin trip for months. It wasn't supposed to be scary. I just needed a break from the constant hum of city life. The noise, the people, the pressure. I found a small cabin deep in the mountains, far from any major road or town. It was the kind of place where cell service disappeared halfway up the trail, and the only lights came from your flashlight or the sun when it wasn't hidden behind thick clouds. The idea of being alone in nature had appealed to me for weeks. I thought it would be peaceful, quiet, maybe even restorative. I didn't imagine it could feel threatening. The drive up was longer than I expected. The directions the rental company sent were vague. Mostly turn left after the old oak tree, then continue until you see the stream. The last stretch was a dirt road that narrowed into a barely visible track, the edges overgrown with weeds and brambles. At some points, the car tires slipped over loose stones, and I had to inch forward slowly to avoid sliding down the slope. The air smelled different the higher I went, fresher, heavier with pine, wet earth, and something else I couldn't identify at first. It wasn't unpleasant, just dense. By the time I arrived, the sun was dipping behind the mountain ridges. The cabin came into view just as the shadows grew long. It was a single-story structure made of logs, with a sloped roof and a small porch out front. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney, though there was no sign of anyone. I parked and got out, stretching my legs. The air was cool, and the wind moved the pine needles in soft whispers. At first, it was the perfect retreat. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust and old wood. There were signs someone had lived there recently. A half-empty jar of peanut butter, a few cans of beans stacked in a corner, a stack of firewood by the stove. I unpacked slowly, arranging my things in the modest bedroom and putting a kettle on the stove. I wanted a fire, but the wood was damp. I tried to dry a few pieces, but it was too late in the evening to get a proper flame going. So, I lit a single lantern, its yellow glow filling the main room, and ate a small meal. Night came fast. It was darker than I had imagined. With no artificial lights around, the windows showed nothing but blackness. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the edges of the cabin. The sound made my stomach tighten. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the forest, just the wind, nothing more. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The first noise came a little after 9, a faint scraping, like someone dragging a heavy boot across the rocks outside. I froze, listening. It stopped. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. I checked the doors and windows. Everything was locked. Nothing seemed out of place. Still, I could hear occasional cracks from the floorboards and the ceiling, subtle groans as the cabin settled under its own weight and the cold. But then I heard the heavier sound again, like someone stepping carefully on the porch. I stayed completely still, my chest tight, and the sound faded after a minute. I thought maybe I had imagined it. The next morning, I explored the area around the cabin. There was a small clearing and a stream a few hundred meters away. I thought the noises could have been wildlife, but there were no obvious animal tracks near the cabin itself. Just the usual signs of small creatures, squirrels, birds, raccoons. Nothing that explained what I had heard. The sun gave me some comfort. During daylight, everything felt normal, harmless even. I tried to focus on the beauty of the place. The way the sunlight fell on the trees, the way the stream babbled over rocks. But in the back of my mind, the tension lingered. That evening, the wind picked up again. I had built a small fire inside the cabin, and I sat near it, trying to read and eat. But the shadows seemed longer than they should have been. Around midnight, I was woken by a loud bang, like someone had struck the door. My heart jumped into my throat. I grabbed the flashlight and opened the door cautiously. Outside, nothing. No footprints, no signs of intrusion. I felt the air on my face, sharp and cold, and saw nothing but the darkness of the forest. The trees swayed with the wind, but I couldn't see anything approaching. I tried to sleep after that, but every sound, every creak, every rustle, made my pulse spike. The wind seemed to carry sounds closer, as if someone or something was moving deliberately. Around 3 in the morning, I heard footsteps coming from the far side of the cabin. They were slow, careful, almost methodical. I stayed as quiet as possible, listening. Then, I heard the sound of metal scraping on wood, like a crowbar being dragged along the cabin wall. My mind raced. Whoever or whatever was out there had the ability to wait and move quietly, and they were testing the cabin. I didn't leave. I didn't open the door. I waited, breathing as quietly as possible, trying to calm the fear that made my stomach churn. Eventually, the sounds stopped. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting by the fire with the door locked and the curtains drawn tight. I realized then that this was the danger of being so isolated. There was no one around to help, and no quick way to get out. If someone wanted to break in, I could be trapped. Morning came slowly. I stepped outside with a stick, scanning the area. No one had been there. No footprints in the dirt. No disturbed leaves. Nothing. I wondered if it had been an animal. A large, bold animal might make noises like that. Maybe a bear, though that seemed unlikely so close to the cabin. Maybe a human who had tried to scare me. I had no way of knowing. I decided to stay, but I prepared for the worst. I found an axe in the cabin corner, sharp and heavy, and kept it nearby. I moved the heaviest pieces of furniture in front of the doors and windows, just in case. I built a more substantial fire, one that could burn all night if necessary. I stayed alert, listening to the wind, the creaks, the distant calls of birds. Every sound made me tense, but at least it kept me focused. Days passed, and the noises didn't repeat immediately, though the feeling of being watched never completely went away. I stayed busy, collecting firewood, checking the stream, and keeping the cabin in order. I realized that much of my fear came from the unknown, something I couldn't see, couldn't track. By midweek, the tension had dulled slightly. I could sleep in short bursts, wakeful and alert, but at least I wasn't frozen with fear anymore. On the fifth night, the wind was high and the shadows deep. I was sitting near the fire when I saw movement outside, a figure at the edge of the clearing. I froze, heart hammering. This time, it was unmistakable. A human silhouette, standing still, watching the cabin. My mind raced, considering what to do. The figure didn't move closer, didn't make a sound, but I could feel the eyes on me. I grabbed the axe and stayed hidden near the window, trying to calm myself. The figure left after a few minutes. I didn't see it go into the woods. It seemed to vanish into the shadows, but I could feel the tension lingering, thick in the air. The rest of the night passed slowly, my nerves stretched tight. I stayed awake until dawn, watching the light slowly wash over the trees. When I finally stepped outside in the morning, the clearing was empty, but the ground bore signs someone had been there. Footprints, shallow depressions, marks on the bark of nearby trees. They weren't animal tracks. They were human. That morning, I packed my things and left. I drove down the narrow mountain road with my eyes constantly scanning the treeline, heart racing at every sound. By the time I reached the paved highway, I felt some relief, though a lingering unease stayed with me. I realized that the cabin had been beautiful, peaceful, and quiet in the day, but at night, the isolation made the place dangerous. It wasn't ghosts or fairy tales that threatened me. It was the real possibility of another human, one who could take advantage of the solitude. When I returned home, I filed a report with the local authorities about the footprints, the disturbances, and the sense of someone nearby. They didn't seem surprised. The area had a reputation for hikers and campers encountering other people who preferred to remain hidden. No arrests were made, and I never went back. But the memory of those nights stayed with me. The silence, the wind, the feeling of being watched, and the lesson was clear. Isolation can make even the most peaceful places threatening. And sometimes, danger doesn't announce itself with noise or violence. It waits patient, hidden in the shadows. After weeks of reflection, I understood why I had been scared. I had underestimated the power of isolation. I had assumed the world outside the city would be safe. In reality, the mountains offered no protection, only exposure. The wind, the darkness, and the trees became a stage, and the figure that watched from the shadows reminded me that the world was full of people who could use the solitude of others for their own purposes. I never returned to that cabin, but I never forgot the lesson. The relief I felt when I reached safety, surrounded by people, paved roads, and lights that never went out, was profound. I slept normally again. I no longer felt the constant tension of eyes watching from the dark. But every time I hear the wind howl through the trees or the rustle of leaves in the night, my mind flashes back to that cabin. and I remember just how vulnerable we can be when we are truly alone. I had been driving for hours through winding forest roads, the kind that seemed to stretch forever without any sign of civilization. I had left the highway early in the afternoon, carrying nothing but a few supplies, a small backpack, and the kind of restless energy that only comes from needing to escape everything for a while. My destination was a cabin tucked away deep in the mountains, a place I had rented for a week. The description had promised seclusion, a private pond, and a surrounding forest thick with pine trees. On the map, it looked far enough from anyone to feel completely alone, and that's exactly what I wanted. When I finally saw it, the cabin was smaller than I imagined, but sturdy. Its walls were made of dark, weathered wood, and the windows reflected the fading sunlight like black mirrors. A thin trail led up to the porch, covered in leaves and pine needles. I parked the car and stepped out, stretching, feeling the crisp mountain air fill my lungs. The smell of damp wood and pine needles was strong, sharp, and real. There was a strange silence in the forest, the kind that felt heavy, almost like the woods were watching me. I shrugged it off, blaming my imagination. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of dust and old wood. It had a small kitchen, a living area with a worn couch and 2 bedrooms. A stone fireplace sat against one wall, unused but still intact. The cabin had power, but it was unreliable according to the description, so I wasn't counting on lights lasting all night. I unpacked slowly, placing my few belongings neatly, then opened the windows to let the fresh air in. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the forest in a dull, gray twilight. The first night passed uneventfully. I lit a small lantern and sat by the fireplace, feeling comforted by the faint flicker of light. Outside, I could hear small movements, the wind brushing through the trees, the occasional snap of a branch, distant birds settling in for the night. I told myself it was normal and that I was imagining things when shadows seemed to move just beyond the edge of the light. Still, I slept poorly, waking more than once at sudden sounds, the kind that seem louder when there's no one else around. The next morning, I decided to explore the property. The cabin sat at the edge of a small clearing, the forest thickening just beyond. There was a path down to a pond, and as I walked toward it, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. Footprints in the mud. They weren't mine. They were fresh, the edges still soft, leading from the forest toward the cabin. I froze, staring at them, counting silently. 1 set of prints, adult-sized, no other signs of anyone around. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the sudden rush of anxiety. Maybe it was a hiker, maybe a neighbor who hadn't mentioned their presence. The cabin description hadn't said it was completely isolated, just secluded. I forced myself to continue down to the pond. The water was still and dark, reflecting the gray sky above. I sat at the edge for a while, trying to relax, trying to let the quiet wash over me. But every little sound made me jump. The rustling of leaves, a distant bird, the creak of a branch. I decided to return to the cabin, keeping an eye on the trees as I walked. By the time I reached the cabin, I had convinced myself that the footprints were nothing, that isolation always made ordinary sounds seem sinister. That evening, I started a fire in the fireplace, wanting to feel a sense of control over the night. I chopped wood, arranged it carefully, and lit the kindling. The crackle and warmth of the fire were comforting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed. Every so often, I'd glance out the window into the darkness, but there was nothing, only the outlines of trees swaying. I tried to read, tried to distract myself, but I kept hearing small, subtle noises outside. Footsteps on the porch, a branch snapping. My heart would race, and I'd remind myself it was the wind. The second night, things began to feel different. I was lying in bed when I heard it, a faint scratching at the door. I froze, listening, my body tense. The sound came again, a soft drag, deliberate. I stayed completely still, telling myself it must be a branch brushing against the door, but the sound moved slightly, almost as if it were trying to circle around the cabin. I didn't sleep well that night, Every little noise made me jump. The wind became a threat, the trees became shapes, and the dark corners of the cabin felt alive with possibility. In the morning, I investigated. Outside, there were more footprints, this time circling the cabin, leading back into the woods. Someone had been there during the night. My stomach churned, panic rising. I checked the doors and windows. Everything was still locked. I began thinking about the supplies I had: food, water, a small stove, a flashlight. Not much, but enough to survive for a while if I had to. I decided not to go anywhere, to stay inside, to wait until I could see the road again. The next day, I stayed indoors almost entirely. I brought logs into the fireplace, kept the fire burning, and monitored the windows. Occasionally, I saw shadows in the distance, movements between the trees. I couldn't tell if they were people or animals. I avoided going outside as much as possible. At some point, I realized I hadn't eaten properly. My stomach was tight, my hands shaky. I forced myself to eat a small portion of canned food. Every sound was magnified. Every rustle, snap, or distant thud made me tense, my mind imagining the worst. By the third night, fear had taken over more fully. I slept with a kitchen knife under my pillow and a flashlight within reach. I sat by the window for long stretches, staring into the dark, my eyes straining to catch anything out of place. The forest around the cabin seemed to close in, the trees forming walls, the shadows becoming more aggressive in my mind. Then I heard it again, the dragging sound, closer this time, circling the cabin slowly. I didn't move, barely breathing, listening. The sound continued intermittently through the night, never coming into the light, never revealing itself fully. In the early morning, I ventured outside cautiously. The footprints were different now. Some fresh, some older, multiple sets, circling the cabin, coming from the woods, sometimes stopping, sometimes disappearing entirely. Someone had been here repeatedly. Fear rose with each step I took, but I knew I couldn't leave without a plan. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios. Someone could be living nearby, hidden, watching. Someone could attack if they wanted to. I spent the next day preparing. I reinforced the doors with furniture, barricaded the windows partially with boards I found in the shed, and kept the fire burning constantly so it was easy to see if someone tried to approach. I kept my phone nearby, though I had no service, and I felt the isolation pressing in more heavily than ever. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, each minute longer than the last. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I stayed alert, listening to the scratching and dragging sounds. I kept the lights low, the fire burning, moving quietly whenever I needed to check the windows. Eventually, just before dawn, the sound stopped. Exhausted, I sank to the floor, barely able to move, heart pounding, feeling both relief and the weight of fear pressing on me. The following morning, I decided I needed to leave no matter what. I packed as quietly and efficiently as I could, keeping my backpack ready. I stayed alert to the sounds of the forest, moving in short bursts from window to door to car. When I finally reached the trail that led back to the main road, I didn't stop, didn't look back, just ran, tripping over roots and rocks, pushing through the thick underbrush until I saw the highway. When I reached the first gas station and civilization again, I collapsed against the wall, exhausted, shaking, overwhelmed with relief. I told no one the full details of what I experienced. I wasn't sure anyone would believe me, but I knew I had survived something very real. The cabin had been a trap of fear, isolation, and uncertainty, but I had managed to navigate it, using logic, awareness, and caution. I had learned to recognize the difference between imagination and reality, to trust my instincts, and to survive despite the pressure of paranoia and danger. Looking back, I realized I had been lucky. Whoever or whatever had left those footprints could have been dangerous. The experience left me cautious, aware of how quickly fear can take over, and how thin the line is between safety and vulnerability in a place so isolated. I never went back to that cabin. I never wanted to, but the memory stayed with me. The smell of damp wood, the cold night air, the scratching at the door, and the knowledge that, even in total isolation, someone could be watching. And that awareness, sharp and clear, stayed with me for a long time after, a lesson in caution, preparedness, and survival. I had been planning the trip for months. The idea was simple: escape the city, disappear into the woods for a few days, and spend time alone in a cabin I had rented deep in the forest. I wanted silence, isolation, and the kind of peace that only comes from being completely removed from human life. When I drove up to the cabin, my first impression was that it was perfect. The road had narrowed to dirt a few miles out, flanked by tall pines that nearly touched each other at the top. By the time I turned onto the last winding trail, the cabin was barely visible through the dense trees. It looked rustic but sturdy, made of old logs that were weathered and gray. The roof had moss growing on it, and smoke curling from the stone chimney would have made it seem cozy in any other context. But right now, it gave off a feeling of desolation. The first night, I stayed up later than I had intended. I wanted to see the forest in the dark, but as the sun dipped below the horizon, shadows stretched and twisted between the trees. There was a sound to the forest at night that I had never heard in the city. Wind brushing through branches created a low, eerie rustle, but there were other sounds too. Small scuttling noises, the snap of twigs, distant rustling. It wasn't loud, but it was constant. My mind, conditioned to human safety, started inventing figures in the darkness. I tried to ignore them, pouring myself a glass of water and sitting near the fireplace. The cabin was sparsely furnished. A small kitchen with a wood stove, a table with 2 chairs, a single bed in the corner with a thin mattress, and a few shelves holding outdated books and canned food. It wasn't luxurious, but it was enough for me. The second day, I decided to explore the surrounding area. I packed a backpack with water, snacks, and a flashlight, then walked down a narrow trail that led away from the cabin. The forest was thick, and the air smelled of damp soil and pine needles. The deeper I went, the quieter it became, and the more alert I felt. Birds occasionally chirped, and a deer ran across the path at one point, but otherwise it was unnervingly silent. By late afternoon, I realized I had walked farther than I expected. I tried to mark the path, but the forest floor was covered in fallen leaves, and everything looked the same. I started to feel a mild panic as shadows grew longer. When I finally returned to the cabin, the sun was setting, and the light was dim. The woods around the cabin took on a grayish tone, the shadows so dense that I could barely see the outline of the trees. That evening, I locked the cabin door, placed some sticks near the fire, and sat close, listening. There were noises outside, shifts in the leaves, distant thumps, and sometimes the sound of something heavy moving. I told myself it was just deer, raccoons, or maybe a bear. The thought of a bear made me tense, but I tried to relax, pouring water into a pan and setting it on the stove to boil. I had brought a small first aid kit, and my phone had a signal strong enough to send a message, but I couldn't help feeling more isolated than I ever had before. On the third day, I woke early. Mist covered the forest, turning the world gray and quiet. I decided to walk to a small creek I had seen on the map. The path was steep, and the ground was slippery from last night's rain. I slipped a few times but managed to reach the creek after an hour. The water ran clear and fast, and I drank a little before filling my bottle. As I rested on a rock, I thought I heard someone else moving through the trees. At first, I assumed it was an early hiker, but as the sounds continued, my stomach dropped. There was no trail nearby for another cabin or road. Whoever or whatever was there was inside the forest with me. I packed up quickly and headed back, choosing a slightly different route to avoid being followed in case it was a person. When I returned, I found something I hadn't expected. The cabin door was slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it. My heart raced. I stepped inside slowly, scanning every corner. Nothing appeared disturbed. I checked the windows. All were intact. I double-checked the locks. Still, the feeling lingered. It was a gnawing tension in my chest, the kind you get when your mind senses danger but your eyes see nothing. That night, I made sure all the doors and windows were locked, placed heavy furniture in front of the entrance, and kept a large kitchen knife next to me while I slept lightly in the corner of the bed. The fourth day was worse. I woke to the sound of something outside the cabin. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate. They circled the cabin slowly. I could hear the crunch of broken branches and leaves underfoot. I froze. I didn't move. For several minutes, I listened as the footsteps circled again. Then they stopped. I couldn't see anything in the darkness beyond the windows, but the air felt different. My stomach tightened with fear. I realized then that I wasn't just isolated. I was being watched. The forest had turned from a sanctuary into a trap. I stayed inside all day. I didn't even bring myself to open the door to gather firewood. I rationed my food and water carefully. The sounds never stopped. Small thumps on the roof, branches scraping against the sides, occasional snapping of twigs that could only be from something large moving nearby. Sleep was impossible. Every time I dozed, I awoke to a shadow crossing the window or a thump against the wall. I started to feel the pressure of panic in a more physical way. My hands trembled, my chest ached, my stomach churned. I knew I had to stay calm, but my body was shutting down under fear. The fifth day, I realized I needed to act. I couldn't wait for whatever was out there to do something worse. I remembered that the nearest ranger station was a couple of miles back down the main trail. I packed what little I had, water, some food, and my jacket, and prepared to leave. I waited until the middle of the morning when the light was brighter, giving me a slight advantage of visibility. The steps were tense. Every snap of a twig made me jump. Every rustle of leaves had me spinning in circles. The forest felt endless. I kept telling myself, one step at a time, one step at a time. Halfway back, I stumbled upon a shallow pit covered with leaves. I realized later that it was probably an old trap for deer or other wildlife. It was sharp-edged and deep enough to break a leg. My heart jumped, thinking what could have happened if I had fallen in the dark. This forest was not only isolating but full of hidden dangers. By the time I reached the main dirt road, I was exhausted, soaked in sweat, and my legs were trembling. When I finally saw the ranger station, a small wooden building at the edge of a clearing, relief washed over me. The station seemed deserted, but a truck was parked nearby. I ran up the steps and banged on the door until a ranger appeared. He was middle-aged, sturdy, and calm. I explained in brief and clipped words what had happened. The isolation, the noises, the door left ajar. His face grew serious. He radioed another ranger to check the cabin, telling me not to return there alone. I waited while they drove with me in their truck back to the site. The cabin was still standing, everything intact, but the surrounding forest had signs of human presence. Footprints, trampled leaves, and small disturbances near the windows. Whoever had been circling the cabin had left but could have returned at any time. The ranger advised me not to stay alone in such an isolated place again and reminded me that the woods, beautiful as they were, could be dangerous when people were nearby who should not have been. I left the forest that evening. The trip was meant to be peaceful, a simple escape from city life, but it had turned into one of the most frightening experiences of my life. I realized that the wilderness doesn't care about our plans. It is indifferent, and sometimes other people or predators can turn it into a trap. I was lucky, and I understood that clearly. Once back in the city, I took time to process everything. I organized my thoughts, wrote down the timeline of events, and spoke with the ranger again by phone, confirming the cabin had been checked and no one else was found. Over time, the fear subsided, replaced by a cautious respect for the forest. I started hiking again, but only on well-marked trails and never alone. I kept the lessons of those days close. Preparedness, caution, and the knowledge that isolation can amplify every sound, every shadow, every movement into a threat. That cabin, now safely behind me, remained a symbol of survival and of respect for forces larger than myself, human or natural. Even now, years later, I sometimes dream of those steps circling the cabin, the quiet rustling just outside the window, and the unbearable tension of not knowing whether I was truly alone. The experience changed me. I learned that fear in isolation is not imaginary. It is a real measure of survival instincts, sharpened to a razor's edge when civilization is miles away. But I also learned that awareness, careful planning, and controlled action can turn fear into clarity and chaos into a path back to safety. I had been planning this trip for months. The thought of spending a week alone in a remote cabin had filled me with a strange mix of excitement and unease. The cabin itself was tucked deep into the forest, far from the nearest town, accessible only by a rough, unpaved road that twisted through thick pine and maple trees. I wanted solitude, a chance to escape the constant noise of work, emails, and people. I had imagined mornings waking to sunlight filtering through the windows, afternoons spent reading or walking in the woods, and evenings by the fire, the only sound the crackle of burning logs. I did not imagine fear, but it came anyway, creeping slowly, subtly, and then all at once. The drive to the cabin was long and tiring. The road became narrower as I left the main highway behind, the trees pressing close on either side. The branches scratched the side of the car in places, and small rocks rattled along the undercarriage. I had a map, though I didn't really need it. The GPS barely worked here, only giving a vague idea of direction. At some point, the sunlight vanished entirely, absorbed by the dense canopy overhead. Shadows moved strangely among the trees, and every animal noise, the distant scream of a bird, the rustle of a squirrel, sounded like something bigger. My knuckles whitened on the steering wheel, but I told myself I was being ridiculous. I wasn't scared. I was careful. That was different. I arrived at the cabin in the late afternoon. It was exactly as it had been described online. Small, wooden, sturdy, with a single story and a chimney that suggested it had been built decades ago. A thin trail led from the small dirt parking area to the front door. The surrounding forest was silent in a way that was almost too complete. No cars, no planes, no distant sounds of civilization. Just the wind moving through the trees. I parked, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment, listening. The quiet felt heavy, like a weight pressing down from above. The cabin smelled of wood and something else I couldn't place, a faint muskiness of age and damp. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The interior was simple but functional. A small kitchen, a living area with a worn sofa and a wood-burning stove, a single bedroom, and a bathroom. A stack of firewood sat near the stove, and the windows had thick curtains. There was an old rug on the floor, faded, and the walls were lined with wooden panels that had darkened with age. I set my bags down and took a deep breath. It was perfect. It was isolated. It was exactly what I had wanted. I spent the first evening cleaning, unpacking, and preparing a simple meal on the stove. The forest outside had darkened completely now. I lit the fire and sat back in the old armchair, listening to the flames crackle. The silence was almost complete, except for the occasional sound of the wind outside. The isolation felt peaceful at first, but as the minutes passed, I realized just how alone I was. I told myself it was fine, that I had done this before in less remote locations. Still, there was something about the forest that seemed to watch me, something patient and unhurried. Sleep did not come easily. I lay in the bed, the blankets pulled tight around me, listening. The wind had picked up outside, rattling the windows. The trees creaked and groaned. Every small noise sounded louder in the emptiness of the cabin. At one point, I thought I heard something moving outside, a scraping, faint but deliberate. I sat up, straining to see through the darkness. Nothing, probably a branch or a deer or some small animal. I forced myself to lie back down and close my eyes. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I slept, though not soundly. The next day, I explored the surrounding area. There was a narrow trail behind the cabin that led deeper into the forest. I walked for hours, my boots crunching over leaves and broken branches. The forest seemed endless, shifting constantly, with the sunlight barely reaching the forest floor. Occasionally, I came across deer tracks or the remnants of a fallen tree. Everything looked untouched, unvisited. At first, the solitude was invigorating, but by mid-afternoon, I began to feel watched. Not in the sense of a person being there, but like the forest itself was aware of me. My pace quickened, though I couldn't explain why. I told myself it was paranoia, that I was alone, that nothing was there. That night, the wind grew stronger, and the trees thrashed against each other. I had stacked firewood carefully near the stove, but the sound of something hitting the cabin wall made me jump. I checked the locks on the doors and windows. Everything was secure. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was moving just beyond the walls, just beyond the trees. I tried to read, to distract myself, but the firelight seemed weak and inadequate against the darkness pressing in from outside. I noticed every creak of the cabin, every whisper of the wind, every distant crack of a branch. Sleep became impossible. The next morning, I decided to leave the cabin and hike down the trail to a small creek I had seen marked on the map. I wanted fresh air, a sense of movement, a reminder that the world was bigger than the walls pressing in around me. I packed a small backpack with water, snacks, a flashlight, and my phone, which barely had a signal. The trail was narrow and overgrown, and I realized how little preparation I had actually done for this environment. By the time I reached the creek, I was sweating, my legs scraped by branches. The creek itself was shallow but clear, the sound of running water soothing after the oppressive silence of the forest. I sat on a rock, drank some water, and tried to relax. Then I noticed something odd. Footprints. Human footprints, fresh, leading away from the creek and into the forest. My pulse quickened. I had assumed I was alone, but someone else had been here recently. The footprints were large, heavy, and uneven, as if the person had been moving quickly. I debated following them but quickly dismissed the idea. I didn't want to meet whoever it was in this remote place. I packed my things and hurried back to the cabin, my senses alert, listening for any sound of pursuit. There was none. The forest seemed as empty as before, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been noticed. Back at the cabin, I checked the perimeter, looking for any signs of someone approaching. Nothing. The door was still locked, the window secure. I sat by the fire for hours, heart still racing. I told myself I was overreacting, that the footprints could have been from a hiker passing by days ago. Still, I felt vulnerable, isolated in a way I hadn't anticipated. Over the next few days, the unease grew. Every night, I heard noises outside, footsteps crunching on leaves, branches snapping, a distant scraping sound. The wind made the forest seem alive, almost deliberate in its movement. I avoided going far from the cabin, staying close to the safety of the walls. I double-checked the locks, moved the firewood closer to block windows, and kept my flashlight and a heavy stick within reach at all times. I began to notice small details I had missed before. Scratches on the doorframe, marks in the dirt near the porch, a sense that the cabin was no longer just a shelter, but a focal point for something watching. On the fifth night, the fear reached its peak. The wind had stopped, leaving an unnatural silence that pressed against the cabin walls. Around midnight, I heard it clearly. The sound of someone trying to open the back door. My heart leapt. I grabbed my flashlight and the heavy stick, moving toward the sound. There was nothing when I peered outside. I shone the light around the yard. Shadows stretched and moved with the trees, but no one was there. My hands shook, my breathing ragged. I realized that whoever had been here might have been watching for days, tracking my movements. The night stretched endlessly. I stayed awake, sitting by the stove, the stick in hand, listening to every sound. At first light, I ventured outside. The snow had started falling lightly, dusting the ground in white. The footprints were back, around the cabin, large and irregular, leading to the tree line and vanishing into the forest. I understood then that leaving immediately was the only option. I packed quickly, everything I owned, and made sure doors and windows were secured as best as I could. My car was still where I had left it. I kept my eyes on the forest as I drove down the narrow road, the engine noise sharp against the quiet, my pulse still racing. By the time I reached the main highway, the fear had ebbed but not completely vanished. I called the local authorities to report the footprints, but by the time they arrived, there was no sign of anyone. The forest was dense, and the snow had covered everything. I returned to my life, but the sense of being watched lingered. I never went back to the cabin, never even considered it. But the memory of that week, the quiet, the isolation, and the footprints in the snow, stayed with me in a way I could never forget. I realized then that solitude in the wilderness carries a cost, a vulnerability that no preparation can entirely erase. I learned to respect that vulnerability, to understand that sometimes the fear isn't in the presence of someone else. It's in the possibility, in the realization that you are alone, and anything could happen. And in that realization, I found both caution and clarity. I was alive. I had survived. I had faced the fear, unrelenting, unspoken, and I had come through it. That clarity, that certainty, was the only thing I carried back with me, the only reward for facing the quiet, relentless tension of a place that knew my weakness and tested my resolve. I had always thought of myself as cautious, someone who planned things carefully. That's why renting a small cabin deep in the mountains had seemed like a good idea at first. The idea was simple. A few days alone, far from cell service, far from people, just me and the quiet of the forest. I didn't know then how much I underestimated how unpredictable the wilderness could be, and how quickly a simple weekend could turn into something frighteningly intense. I arrived at the cabin in the late afternoon, carrying my pack and a few bags of supplies. The road leading up to it was narrow and rocky, twisting through tall pines and dense underbrush. The GPS had stopped working about 20 minutes before the cabin, leaving me relying on an old paper map that had started to tear at the edges. The air was crisp, with a faint smell of damp earth and pine sap. The mountains loomed around me, shadowing the narrow path ahead. By the time I reached the small clearing where the cabin stood, the sun was already dipping behind the peaks, painting the sky in muted oranges and purples. The cabin itself was modest: weathered wood, a stone chimney, and a small porch with a single wooden rocking chair. From a distance, it looked inviting. Up close, it had the musty smell of abandonment mixed with the faint scent of old smoke. I had a key from the rental office, and after a few fumbling moments, I managed to unlock the door. Inside, it was small but functional. A main room with a table, a couple of chairs, a wood stove, and a loft above with a bed and a tiny storage space. The windows were dusty, but I could see the forest pressing close on all sides. I set my supplies down and started making the cabin feel a little more like home. I stacked firewood near the stove, checked the water supply, and unpacked food and essentials. As I moved around, I noticed small signs that the cabin had been used recently. Footprints in the dust on the floor, a few empty cans hidden in a corner, a small fire pit outside with ashes that looked fresh. It wasn't abandoned at all. Someone had been here, maybe even in the past few days. That thought didn't alarm me yet, but I made a mental note to be more careful. The first night was quiet, almost eerily so. The forest seemed alive with sounds, though. Leaves rustling, the distant crack of branches, the low groan of the wind through the pines. I couldn't see anything outside, but I could sense the shapes and movement beyond the glass. I told myself it was just animals, nothing more. Still, I kept a small knife on the table next to my sleeping bag, more for comfort than necessity. The next day, I explored the area around the cabin. There was a small stream about 100 meters away and a narrow trail leading deeper into the woods. The air was damp, and the ground was slippery with fallen leaves. I noticed tracks, human tracks I realized later larger than mine, and a few sets of them. I followed them briefly, curiosity tugging me, but then I stopped. They didn't seem fresh, but the fact that someone had been here recently made me uneasy. I decided not to stray too far. As evening approached, I prepared another fire in the stove, cooking a simple meal of canned beans and rice. The fire cast long shadows across the walls, making the room feel smaller than it was. That night, sleep came slower. Every little sound, branches tapping on the roof, the wind rattling the windows, the faintest scrape against the door, kept me alert. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was nothing. On the third day, things began to feel off. I woke up early, around 5 a.m., to the sound of movement outside. Not the usual wind or small animals, but something heavier. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, pacing around the perimeter of the cabin. My first thought was that someone might be lost, someone wandering through the forest, but the way the footsteps circled the cabin made my stomach knot. I stayed still, clutching the knife under the covers, listening. They stopped eventually, but the sense of being watched didn't. I tried to convince myself to ignore it. Maybe it was an animal, a large deer, or even a bear, though the sounds didn't match anything I had heard before. I didn't leave the cabin that day. I stayed near the window, watching the forest, trying to spot any movement. Hours passed, and finally the footsteps were gone. The air seemed heavier, though, like the forest itself, was holding its breath. The fourth day was worse. I had planned to explore the trail deeper into the woods, but I couldn't bring myself to leave the cabin. Every time I looked outside, I thought I saw shadows shifting among the trees. I checked the firewood and the doors, making sure everything was secure. I even considered leaving, driving back down the mountain, but the roads were rough, and I didn't know if I could make it safely. I rationed my food and water, knowing that I might need to stay longer than expected if something went wrong. By the evening, I could feel myself unraveling. The isolation, the constant sense of being watched, and the realization that I was completely alone in a place where help could be hours away started to weigh heavily on me. I couldn't tell if I was imagining things or if someone really had been circling the cabin. My sleep was fitful, filled with dreams of intruders I couldn't see. Then, on the fifth night, it happened. I was lying in the loft, trying to convince myself to sleep, when I heard it, scraping at the door, low, deliberate, slow. My heart nearly stopped. I froze, listening as the sound grew louder. Whoever or whatever was outside was testing the door. I grabbed my knife, creeping down the stairs, trying to make myself as small and silent as possible. The door rattled once, then again. I realized they had a crowbar or something similar, the way the lock and wood groaned under pressure. Panic surged. I had to think fast. The windows were small and high, not practical for escape. The porch might give me a slight advantage, but it was exposed. I looked around desperately and found the axe by the stove. My plan was risky, but I had no choice. If someone got inside, I was alone, and I had to defend myself. The door shuddered under the next strike. I gripped the axe tightly, waiting. Then I heard it. A voice, low and muttering, trying to figure out how to get in. Whoever it was, they weren't expecting resistance. I swung the axe at the door frame as hard as I could, cracking the wood. The intruder cursed and retreated, pounding on the door one last time before I heard footsteps running away into the trees. I stayed awake the rest of the night, barely sleeping. The forest was quiet after that, but the feeling of being watched lingered. The next morning, I inspected the door. The frame was cracked, the lock splintered, and I realized how lucky I had been. Whoever had tried to break in had probably intended to rob or even harm whoever was inside. The realization was chilling. Over the next 2 days, I focused on repairing the door as best I could, using spare wood and tools I had brought. I also found a small cabin radio and sent out an emergency signal, hoping someone would respond if things went wrong. I stayed alert, only leaving the immediate vicinity for short stretches to gather water from the stream. Every sound, every shadow kept me tense. I had learned to move silently, to listen carefully, and to trust my instincts completely. Finally, on the 7th day, as I was preparing to leave for the nearest ranger station, I saw a small trail of footprints leading away from the cabin. They were deeper, heavier than mine, and they headed downhill toward the main road. Relief washed over me as I realized the intruder was gone. I didn't see them again, but I left the cabin without looking back, my body tense, adrenaline still high. The drive back down the mountain felt surreal. Every turn in the road, every rustle of leaves along the edge of the path, made me flinch. By the time I reached the ranger station, I was exhausted but safe. I reported what had happened, gave descriptions, and left the mountains behind. Even weeks later, I couldn't shake the memory of those nights. The isolation, the sounds, the sheer vulnerability of being alone in a remote cabin. All of it stayed with me, but I also carried a sense of accomplishment. I had survived, stayed alert, and escaped without harm. I learned how fragile safety could be and how important it was to trust instincts, prepare for the worst, and respect the wilderness and the people around you. That cabin trip had started as a simple getaway, but it became one of the most intense, terrifying, and ultimately enlightening experiences of my life. I never returned to that cabin, and I never will. But I often think about it, about how quickly calm can turn into fear, and how careful planning and clear thinking can make the difference between danger and survival.